What if the oldest stories of humanity were not trying to explain the gods, but trying to remember something that had already vanished? That question waits quietly inside the broken clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia. It waits in museum drawers, in excavation notes, in fragments copied by scribes whose names are gone. Historians and Assyriologists read these tablets carefully, one sign at a time, knowing that a single damaged corner can change the mood of an entire myth, and within those signs, the Anunnaki appear again and again, not always as distant heavenly beings, but as powers involved in ordering the world below. That is the first strange thing. The gods in these records do not always behave like vague spirits from a dream. Sometimes they behave like rulers, judges, estate managers, city patrons, and administrators of a system already old. They assign roles, they divide authority, they establish temples, they shape human purpose with a calmness that feels, at times, almost bureaucratic, a little too organized for a simple beginning. So the question begins to form softly. Were the Sumerian texts describing the birth of human civilization? Or were they preserving the memory of something earlier, something already half forgotten by the time the first scribes pressed reeds into clay? You do not need to believe the most extravagant version of the mystery to feel its pull. The grounded world is already mysterious enough. Ancient Sumer, rising in southern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, gave us some of the earliest known writing, cities, temples, accounting systems, legal habits, and literary traditions. Its people wrote on clay because clay was everywhere. River mud could be shaped, marked, dried, stored, buried, and found again thousands of years later by people who spoke no Sumerian and lived beneath electric lights. There is something quietly unsettling about that. A person in a long-dead city presses a reed stylus into wet clay. The tablet dries. The city falls. The language disappears from a living speech. Empires pass over the same ground. Sand gathers. Then, one day, a worker, archaeologist, or local digger lifts a small, brown object from the earth, and an ancient sentence returns without its voice. The tablet remembers. You are standing, in thought, near such a tablet now, not in a loud place, not in a dramatic chamber with flaming torches and secret doors, just a quiet room, perhaps in a museum, where the air is still and the object is smaller than expected. The clay is the colour of dried riverbank. Its edges are chipped, its surface holds rows of wedge-shaped marks, neat and strange, like bird tracks after rain. The label beside it may say that it comes from Nippur, or another Mesopotamian site. It may mention a myth, a hymn, a lexical list, a school exercise, or a royal inscription. The language may be Sumerian or Akkadian, or a later copy of an older tale. Nothing about it looks like the beginning of the world, and yet this is how beginnings survive. Not as thunder, as filing. That is almost funny, in a dry ancient way. Humanity's oldest questions did not arrive to us carved into glowing mountains. They arrived through inventories and copies, school tablets, temple lists, and damaged myths. Someone had to count barley. Someone had to record offerings. Someone had to teach a student how to write the name of a god correctly. And somewhere inside that practical world, the oldest remembered stories of human origin were preserved. This is where the Anunnaki mystery becomes more delicate than the loud versions often suggest. In Sumerian and later Mesopotamian literature, the Anunnaki are not simple figures with one fixed meaning. Their identity shifts across periods, languages, and traditions. Sometimes they are great gods associated with heaven and earth. Sometimes they appear connected with judgment in the underworld. Sometimes they belong to a broader divine council, a kind of sacred assembly where cosmic decisions are made. Scholars debate details because the sources are scattered, layered, and copied across centuries. That uncertainty matters. The record is not one clean book, it's a field of fragments. A line from one city may echo a myth known elsewhere. A later Babylonian text may preserve themes that seem older, A god's name may change in importance from one period to another. A story may survive only because a student copied it in a scribal school, perhaps with a tired hand, perhaps wanting the lesson to end. Still, across the fragments, pattern begins to glimmer. The earliest remembered world is often not empty. It is already arranged. There are gods with ranks, cities with sacred origins, temples with duties, humans with a purpose. The world of the tablets is not a blank wilderness waiting for civilization to appear by accident. It often feels like a system being restored, inherited, or managed. This does not mean the tablets prove some hidden lost civilization ruled the earth. Careful reading does not allow that kind of certainty, but it does allow a quieter thought. Ancient people may have carried memories of deep transitions, floodplains changed by water, settlements buried under newer settlements, rituals older than their explanations, and social orders whose origins had become myth by the time they were written down. Memory can turn history into sacred story. It can also turn trauma into a beginning. You step away from the museum case and let the room fade. The tablet remains, but now the air grows warmer. The floor under you becomes packed earth. The silence becomes the soft noise of river insects. A line of reeds shifts in the evening wind. Somewhere nearby, smoke rises from a small hearth. The smell is clay, ash, animals, and damp river water. Southern Mesopotamia is not a landscape of easy romance. It is flat, bright, and demanding. The rivers feed it, but also threaten it. Fields require canals. Canals require labour. Labour requires organisation. Organisation produces hierarchy, records, disputes, debts, temples, granaries, and officials with opinions. Civilization, when seen close up, is less like a golden sunrise and more like mud, sweat, measurements, and someone arguing over sheep. The first cities did not simply appear, they accumulated. Mud brick by mud brick. In this world, a temple is not just a holy building. It is an economic centre, a storehouse, a workplace, and a symbol of divine ownership. The god of the city is not only worshipped, the god is treated as a great household head, receiving offerings, owning land, and giving identity to the settlement. Priests and administrators maintain the visible order. Scribes give that order memory. That is why the old stories feel so strange. They do not speak of humans as free wanderers who slowly invented structure from nothing. In some myths, humans are made within a divine system already under pressure. The gods have tasks. The gods become burdened. The gods require relief. Humanity enters the story not as the crown of creation, but as a solution to a problem, a practical solution. This is one of the quiet attention points hidden in Mesopotamian creation traditions. In the Atrahasis myth, preserved in Akkadian from older traditions and copied in later periods, humans are created after lesser gods grow weary of labour. The details vary, and the text is not Sumerian in its surviving form, but its themes reach deeply into Mesopotamian thinking. Divine work becomes unbearable. A crisis unfolds among the gods. Humanity is fashioned to take up the burden. It is not a sentimental beginning. It is not even especially flattering. If read plainly, the myth says something ancient and uncomfortable about civilization. Human life is tied to work, duty, noise, and service. The gods want order maintained. The fields must be tended. The offerings must continue. The world must not fall back into chaos. But another reading lingers at the edge. If humans were created to inherit a burden, then what happened before that burden was passed down? Who laboured first? Why did the system already exist? Why do some texts seem less interested in creation from nothing, and more interested in assigning roles inside a pre-existing order? These questions do not need loud answers. They are better left dimly lit. You follow the thought back into the clay. A scribe sits with a tablet on his lap, the reed stylus held carefully in his fingers. Around him, The day is not mystical. It is full of heat, flies, instruction, impatience, and dust. He may be copying a tale already old to him. He may not fully believe it in the way a child believes a bedtime story, or perhaps belief is the wrong word. The story is part of the world's structure. It explains why things are as they are. Gods above, cities below, humans in between. The tablet does not say everything. It cannot. It is broken, copied, translated, and surrounded by silence. Yet the silence is not empty. It is shaped like a missing beginning. And as night gathers over the river plain, you begin to feel that the real mystery is not whether the Sumerians knew some forbidden truth. The deeper mystery is gentler, older, and harder to dismiss. It is whether the first written stories were already late arrivals, trying to preserve memories from a human dawn that had slipped beyond ordinary recall. The clay cools in the dark. The reeds move softly. Somewhere, a beginning remains unread. The first thing you notice is how ordered the divine world seems. Not peaceful, not simple, ordered. In the Mesopotamian imagination, the gods do not float vaguely above human life like distant symbols. They hold territories, offices, powers, privileges, rivalries, and responsibilities. Some are tied to storms, some to wisdom, some to writing, fertility, war, canals, justice, grain, or the dangerous border between life and death. Their world is alive with rank and function, and that alone gives the old stories a strangely administrative feeling. The Anunnaki sit within this larger sacred structure, though never in one perfectly stable form. Their name appears across different Mesopotamian traditions, sometimes connected with the great gods, sometimes with judges, sometimes with powers of the earth and underworld. They are not easy to define, which is exactly why they continue to attract both scholars and dreamers. A clean definition would make them smaller. The fragments make them vast. You can almost feel the difficulty of translation in the room. A sign may be clear, but its meaning may depend on period, genre, and context. A divine group in one hymn may not match the same group in a later myth. A name repeated across centuries can gather layers like silt along a canal bank. By the time a modern reader sees the word Anunnaki in translation, it has already passed through language, copying, damage, excavation, classification, and interpretation. That is not a flaw in the mystery. That is the mystery. In the tablets, divine power often looks like government, but not government in the modern sense. It is more like a sacred household extended across the sky, the earth and the city. The gods receive offerings because the city belongs to them. The temple staff maintains routines because divine presence requires care. Food is prepared. Lamps are lit. Statues are washed and clothed. Incense rises. Names are spoken correctly. The unseen order depends on visible repetition. A god could own fields. A goddess could receive wool. A temple could function like a great estate, employing workers, storing grain, distributing rations, and anchoring the economy of an entire settlement. This is one of the grounded details that makes early Mesopotamia feel so different from modern ideas of religion. Worship was not only private feeling, it was administration, labour, food, land, and record keeping. The sacred had accounts. That small fact has a quiet power. If divine order was expressed through practical systems, then myths about divine order may also preserve memories of real social organisation. They are not merely fantasies floating outside history. They may carry reflections of how ancient people understood authority, labour, environment, kingship, and survival. In that sense, the gods behave like the world they ruled, or perhaps the world was built to resemble the gods. You walk now through a Sumerian city in the mind, not as a tourist, but as someone passing slowly beneath mud brick walls in late light. The air smells of reed mats, kiln smoke, animals, and warm dust. A canal cuts through the settlement like a brown vein. Men lift baskets. Women grind grain. children carry water. Donkeys complain with the timeless bitterness of working animals. At the centre rises the temple precinct. It does not need to be impossibly tall to dominate the world around it. Its power comes from placement, labour, memory, and the belief that the city's divine owner is present there in a way both practical and sacred. Bricks are stamped, offerings arrive, officials speak in low voices, scribes sit near doorways, recording movement through the system. This is where a curious thought begins to settle. If the gods were remembered as administrators, then human civilization may have understood itself as participation in a much older administration. The city was not merely a human invention, it was a reflection of cosmic arrangement. The king did not simply rule because people obeyed him. He ruled because divine order had to be made visible on earth. This idea appears in many forms throughout Mesopotamian history. Kings often presented themselves as chosen by gods, beloved by gods, or appointed to restore justice and maintain temples. City foundations were surrounded by sacred claims. Building inscriptions did more than boast. They tied rulers to divine command, ancient precedent, and the proper care of the gods' houses. A wall could be theology. A canal could be obedience. Yet there is also a stranger edge to this pattern. Some later interpreters have wondered whether the divine bureaucracy in Mesopotamian myth reflects a memory of beings who once governed humans more directly. That thought belongs to the speculative side of the tradition, and it must be handled gently. The tablets do not prove such a thing. They do not give us clean evidence for visitors, lost masters, or forgotten rulers from beyond ordinary history. But the question persists because the stories are unusually structured. The gods hold council, they assign tasks, they debate human noise, they intervene in city life, they approve kingship, they transfer sacred powers. They sometimes seem less like abstract forces and more like an older class of authority whose decisions are remembered through myth. It may simply be that human societies imagined heaven in the image of their own institutions. That is the cautious, scholarly reading, and it is often the strongest one. People knew households, councils, labour gangs, kings, temples, and disputes. Naturally, they pictured divine life through those forms. Still, the reverse possibility has always haunted the edges of the clay. What if ancient people organised their cities in imitation of a divine order they believed had been revealed, inherited, or remembered? What if the sacred administration was not only a projection upward, but a memory downward, a pattern thought to have descended into human life from an earlier age? The uncertainty cannot be resolved cleanly. That is why it breathes. One quiet attention peak appears in the Sumerian concept often translated as the me, the divine powers or decrees associated with civilization's functions. The me are difficult to translate because they are not objects in a simple sense, yet they can be treated in stories almost as transferable powers. They include aspects of kingship, priesthood, truth, craft, music, sexuality, judgment, and social order. They are like the operating codes of civilization, if one uses a modern image carefully. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, these powers are brought from Eridu to Uruk. The story is playful, sacred, and strange. Inanna receives or takes the me from Enki after feasting and drinking, then carries them to her city. The scene can feel almost charming, until you pause over the implication. Civilization's arts and institutions are imagined as powers that can be possessed, moved, and installed. That is a remarkable idea. Not invented slowly, transferred. Of course, myth does not need to be literal to be meaningful. The movement of the me may reflect competition between cities, theological prestige, or the way cultural achievements were attached to divine ownership. Eridu and Uruk were real centres of memory and identity, and stories could express political and religious claims through divine drama. Yet the image remains vivid. Sacred powers travel like cargo. Civilization arrives not merely as discovery, but as an inheritance from beings who already understand its parts. You can feel why later readers lean closer to the tablet. The Anunnaki mystery lives in this atmosphere of ordered transfer, cosmic office, and human dependency. The gods are not only worshipped, they structure existence. The city is not only built, it is authorized. Human work is not only necessary, it is assigned. As evening deepens, the temple courtyard grows quieter. The day's heat loosens from the bricks. Somewhere a reed flute plays a few thin notes, then stops. A scribe closes his tablet while the clay is still damp enough to hold the world's arrangement. The marks he leaves behind will one day seem like evidence. Literature, theology, and riddle at once. You do not need to decide whether the divine administrators were memory, metaphor, or something stranger. For now, it's enough to notice the pattern. At the beginning of written history, humanity already imagined itself inside a system. The gods had offices, the temples had accounts, the cities had patrons. The sacred powers could be listed, moved, and guarded. And somewhere beyond all of it, the Anunnaki remained like a council seen through smoke, close enough to name, too distant to fully understand. The night air cools over the mud brick walls. A tablet dries beside a lamp. Order has been written into clay. The tablet is quiet behind the glass, but the silence around it is crowded. It carries the hands of the ancient scribe, the dust of the excavation, the judgment of the translator, the numbering system of the museum, and the patient doubt of everyone who has tried to make it speak. A small object can gather many worlds around itself. That is one reason the earliest records feel so fragile. They are not only old, they have travelled through too many kinds of darkness. You stand in that museum hush and notice how ordinary the tablet looks. No golden light spills from it. No carved monster guards it. No voice rises from the clay to explain the beginning of humankind. It is brown, cracked, and modest, like something a person might overlook on a work table. Yet this quiet piece of earth may contain a king's boast, a hymn to a goddess, a list of offerings, a school exercise, or a myth copied from an older tradition. So much depends on what survived. Archaeology often begins with brokenness. A site is dug layer by layer, but the past does not unfold like a clean scroll. Walls collapse into floors, fires harden tablets by accident. Floods smear rooms into mud. Later builders reuse older bricks. Looters scatter context. Early excavations, eager and imperfect, sometimes removed objects before recording them with the care modern scholars would prefer. The record arrives wounded. That matters for the Anunnaki mystery, because every large question must pass through small uncertainties. Where was the tablet found? Was it copied from an older source? Is the line complete? Does divine name mean the same thing here as it means in another city? Is the myth being recited, taught, adapted, mocked, simplified, or preserved for reasons now lost? The tablet does not always answer. You can feel the patience required. Assyriologists work with signs that may have several readings. They compare duplicates, study grammar, examine scribal habits, and consult lexical lists left by ancient students and teachers. Sometimes a damaged line can be restored because another copy preserves it. Sometimes a restoration is likely but not certain. Sometimes a word sits there like a closed door, and yet the stories emerge. They emerge through fragments of creation, kingship, flood, divine councils, temple foundations, and human labour. They emerge in texts found at different sites and copied in different periods. The oldest versions are not always the versions that survive most fully. A later tablet can preserve an older tradition. An earlier tablet can be too damaged to guide us safely. Time does not arrange evidence kindly. This is one of the quiet contradictions of ancient history. The nearer we move to the beginning, the less complete the record often becomes. You pass along a row of cases in the imagined museum. One object is a cylinder seal, tiny and beautifully carved, made to roll an image across wet clay. Another is a foundation cone, once placed in a temple wall to mark a ruler's building work. Another is a tablet filled not with myth, but numbers, sheep, barley, oil, and rations. These are not glamorous objects, but they are the bones of memory. They tell you civilization was not only sung, it was counted. The earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia developed largely for administration, especially during the late 4th millennium BC. Before long, literary myths were preserved in polished form. People were recording goods, labour, livestock, and transactions. Writing seems to have grown from practical needs inside increasingly complex cities and temple economies. It was a technology of memory before it became a library of dreams. That grounded fact makes the later myths more intriguing, not less. When a culture that records barley with great care also records divine origins, the two worlds touch. Myth and administration are not opposites. They live in neighbouring rooms. A scribe who copied a sacred story may also have known how to list workers, measure grain, and record obligations owed to a temple. The same hand could serve wonder and accounting. A soft, almost hidden strangeness appears here. Some fringe interpreters look at the mixture of myth and administration and wonder whether the tablets preserve traces of an older managed world, one in which divine beings, culture bringers, or remembered rulers organised human society before ordinary history. That idea stretches beyond what evidence can prove. It belongs in the dim outer ring of possibility, not in the centre. Still, the question is understandable. The tablets often make beginnings feel organised rather than spontaneous. Gods discuss. Powers are assigned. Cities are founded with sacred meaning. Humans appear inside a structure that seems to predate them. Even if this is symbolic, the symbolism is unusually systematic. A careful scholar might say that this reflects the society that produced the texts: temple households, royal courts, labour systems, irrigation works, and scribal schools shaped how people imagined reality. The divine world mirrors the human world because humans use familiar forms to describe the invisible. That explanation has strength. It is probably right in many ways, but the clay keeps its ambiguity, especially when you consider what a museum cannot easily show. Behind every displayed object are thousands of pieces too damaged, too ordinary, or too uncertain to attract attention. Storage rooms hold fragments with only a few signs. Excavation reports mention tablets broken beyond translation. Some artifacts were lost, dispersed, or stripped of context in the long history of collecting. Others remain unread because expertise, time, and preservation are limited. The ancient world is not silent because it had nothing to say. It is silent because much of its speech is missing. This absence becomes part of the mood. You begin to sense that the question is not simply what the tablets reveal, but what kind of memory can survive at all. A civilization may remember its gods while forgetting the exact events that shape those gods. It may preserve a flood story while losing the local disaster that sharpened it. It may continue a ritual long after the first reason for the ritual has dissolved into sacred habit. Museums make the past visible, but they also make loss visible. A statue without a face, a tablet without its ending, a seal without the name of the person who used it, a god whose symbol is clear, but whose oldest meaning has slipped away. There is a gentle sadness in that, and there is curiosity. One tablet may describe a divine assembly, another may name a king who ruled with impossible grandeur, another may preserve a myth in which humans are formed to relieve divine labour, another may record ordinary workers receiving grain. Separate them, and they look like categories. Place them side by side, and a larger pattern begins to breathe through the gaps. Power above, labour below, memory in clay. The strange thing is that the tablets do not feel like fantasy escaping from daily life. They feel like daily life opening into myth. The granary, the temple, the palace, the canal, and the divine council all seem to belong to one continuous order. The scribes did not always draw the sharp line a modern person might prefer. For them, the sacred was practical. The practical was sacred. You remain a little longer before the glass. The room is dim enough for reflection to hover over the tablet's surface. For a moment, your own face appears faintly above the ancient signs. That, too, feels fitting. Every reader places a shadow on the past. Every translation, every theory, Every careful doubt stands between the clay and the beginning it may preserve. The safest approach is humility. The most rewarding approach is attention. Somewhere within the museum, silence. The Anunnaki remain neither fully explained nor free to become whatever modern imagination wants them to be. They belong to texts, cities, rituals, languages, and damaged contexts. They also belong to the human hunger for origins, which is never satisfied by a date on a label. The tablet keeps cooling in its case. The broken signs wait, and the beginning, if it is there, speaks only through what history allowed to survive. Beyond the museum glass, the question begins to move backward, not quickly. The past does not like being rushed. It withdraws in layers, letting you pass from named kings to older kings, from written records to remembered stories, from baked tablets to wet clay, from cities with walls to settlements beneath them, from settlements to traces of reed huts and hearth ash along the river plain. At first, the names still feel familiar. Uruk, Eridu, Nipu, Kish. They sound solid because they appear in texts, maps, excavation reports, and histories of early civilization. But each name is really a doorway. Beneath the known city lies another city. Beneath the temple platform lies an earlier shrine. Beneath the street lies a floor where someone once spilled grain, mended a basket, whispered a prayer, or looked at the river and wondered whether the water would rise too high. The named world rests on an unnamed one. That is the quiet pressure hidden beneath early Mesopotamian history. By the time writing begins to preserve stories in a form we can read, people have already been building, farming, trading, burying their dead, shaping clay, and organizing sacred spaces for a very long time. The first written words do not mark the first human thought. They mark only the moment when thought begins to leave a durable trail. Everything earlier becomes softer. Not unreal, softer. You walk now across the southern alluvium, where land and water seem to negotiate endlessly. The ground is flat, pale, and bright under the sun. Reeds crowd the marsh edges. Birds lift from shallow water in sudden flashes. Mud clings to ankles. The smell is mineral, green, and faintly bitter, with smoke drifting from distant hearths. The horizon feels wide enough to swallow memory. This is a difficult landscape for beginnings. It gives life, but it also erases. Rivers shift, floods spread silt, mud brick melts when neglected, reed structures vanish almost without trace. A settlement can be buried, rebuilt, flattened, and folded into the plain until only a mound remains, a low swelling in the earth that later generations call a tell. A tell is a kind of memory hill, layer upon layer. At places like Eridu, archaeologists found long sequences of sacred construction, with later temples built over earlier ones. The site became associated in Mesopotamian tradition with deep antiquity, wisdom, and the god Enki, lord of freshwater, craft, and hidden knowledge. In later stories, Eridu often feels like a place where civilization begins already listening to something older than itself. That is historically meaningful, even without exaggeration. Eridu's early temple levels show that sacred architecture and communal ritual developed long before many of the literary texts that later celebrated divine order. The exact meanings of those earliest buildings remain debated. Archaeologists can identify platforms, walls, offerings, and rebuilding phases, but they cannot interview the people who stood there. They cannot ask what they believed when they placed food, clay objects, or carefully arranged materials inside a sacred space. The walls remained. The intention is harder. This gap invites careful speculation. Some fringe readers imagine Eridu as a surviving outpost of a lost teaching tradition, a place where older knowledge entered human society from mysterious instructors. That is not something the evidence can establish. Yet Eridu's reputation as an ancient seat of wisdom did become powerful in Mesopotamian memory. Even within accepted history, the city seems to have carried an aura of firstness, a first city, a first shrine, a first whisper of order rising from mud. One curious detail is that Sumerian tradition did not always present civilization as a simple climb from ignorance to invention. Instead, certain things seem bestowed, organized, or brought from one sacred center to another. Kingship descends. Divine powers are assigned. Temples are founded according to patterns that feel older than their builders. This does not prove a hidden age, but it does suggest that the Sumerians imagined culture as inheritance as much as innovation. That distinction matters. Modern people often tell history as progress. Ancient Mesopotamian stories often tell it as reception. The right powers come down. The correct rites are maintained. The temple must be rebuilt properly because the order it represents is not new. The king restores. The scribe copies. The priest repeats. The city renews what has already been given. You can hear the difference in the mood. Innovation is bright and forward-looking. Restoration is older, quieter, and haunted. The old records seem filled with restoration. A ruler claims to rebuild a temple according to ancient plans. A scribe copies words already revered. A myth explains how sacred powers moved into human cities. A king list reaches back before ordinary chronology can safely follow. Again and again, the beginning is not described as something freshly invented in the present. It is treated as something recovered from a deeper order. This creates a small but persistent unease. If early civilization saw itself as restoring order, what disorder was it recovering from? If sacred knowledge was inherited, who first held it? If human memory begins with tablets, what did people remember before tablets gave memory a body? The safe answer is that oral tradition carried stories across generations. Communities remembered floods, migrations, conflicts, rituals, and founders. Over time, these memories became mythic. Names changed, events stretched. Human figures became divine or semi-divine. Historical experiences became cosmic drama. This happens in cultures across the world, and Mesopotamia was no exception. But even that safe answer is full of wonder. Oral memory can preserve patterns for centuries, sometimes longer, while changing their form. A flood becomes the flood. A wise ancestor becomes a sage. A powerful ruler becomes almost impossible in scale. A ruined settlement becomes a place before the world was properly arranged. Memory does not preserve the past like a photograph. It preserves meaning, fear, pride, and warning. It remembers emotionally. The hidden timeline of Mesopotamia is not one neat secret waiting to be opened. It is a braided river. Archaeology gives one channel, myth gives another, environmental history gives another, language, ritual, and political memory create still more. They do not always meet cleanly, but sometimes they run close enough that you sense a deeper current beneath them. That current is where the Anunnaki question continues to drift. They belong to stories written after long development, yet they seem to stand near the architecture of beginnings. They are tied to cosmic order, judgment, divine assembly, and the structure of reality. They do not need to be literal ancient visitors to feel like memories of authority from a world behind the world. They may be mythic expressions of hierarchy, nature, death, kingship, and sacred law. They may also preserve in symbolic form the human awareness that civilization arrived already carrying burdens from older ages. The river wind moves across the plain. You pass a low mound where pottery fragments shine faintly in the dust. No sign announces the first moment. No tablet rises from the soil to say, "Here, this is where human memory began." Instead, there are layers, broken walls, rebuilt shrines, and names that grow dimmer as you follow them down. Before Uruk was the older Urus. Before Eridu's remembered wisdom was Eridu's buried foundation. Before the tablets were voices. Before the voices were experiences now beyond recovery. And somewhere in that soft, receding distance, the beginning becomes less like a point and more like a fog. The Sumerian texts do not give you a map through it. They give you lamps, small ones, set far apart, a god's name, a city's claim, a king's impossible reign, a temple rebuilt over older sacred ground. You follow the lamps slowly. The darkness remains patient. The lamps lead you toward a list, not a story at first, not a hymn, not a prayer sung beneath cedar smoke, just a list of kings, cities, reigns, and transfers of power. It sounds plain until you begin to notice the numbers. Then the clay becomes uneasy. The Sumerian king list is one of those ancient records that seems simple from a distance and stranger the longer you remain with it. It arranges kingship as something that moves from city to city, almost like a sacred possession. One city holds it for a time. Then kingship is taken elsewhere. Dynasties rise. Dynasties end. The pattern feels political, theological, and historical at once. Kingship descends from heaven. That phrase is quiet, but it changes the air. It does not say kingship was invented in a meeting, negotiated by elders, or slowly produced through social pressure. It says kingship came down. It entered the human world from above, already carrying legitimacy. In practical terms, the list helped later rulers and cities place themselves within a grand tradition. It gave political order a sacred memory. Yet even as propaganda, it is unusually revealing. The record wants power to be ancient, older than any one city, older than ordinary proof. You sit with the list as if the tablet rests on a low wooden table. A lamp trembles beside it. The signs are copied, studied, and restored with caution. Some versions differ. Some rulers are known from other sources, while others remain shadowy. The list is not a modern chronicle, and no careful reader treats it as a simple newspaper of early Mesopotamia. Still, it preserves something, a desire for sequence, a memory of cities, a belief that rule itself had a beginning. Then you reach the antediluvian kings, the rulers placed before the flood, and the mood shifts. Their reigns stretch beyond normal human scale. Thousands upon thousands of years are assigned to individual kings and dynasties. The numbers can feel almost dreamlike, as if time itself behaved differently before catastrophe. Eridu appears. Bad Tibira appears. Larak, Sippa, and Shurupak appear in the long shadow before the flood. This is the quiet attention peak of the list. A document that seems concerned with political order suddenly opens into impossible time. Scholars have approached these reign lengths in many ways. Some see them as symbolic numbers shaped by Mesopotamian mathematics and sacred numerology. Some view them as literary signs of extreme antiquity, a way of saying these kings belong to a world beyond normal historical memory. Others read the list as a political composition, designed to connect later cities with a prestigious chain of earlier authority. The debate remains open in important details. The list does not fit cleanly into one category. It is not pure myth, because some later rulers in it are historically attested. It is not pure history, because the earliest reigns cannot be taken literally in ordinary terms. It is not merely fantasy, because it reflects real cities, political memory, and ideas of legitimate rule. It stands in the middle, where myth and history lean against each other. That middle place is where the mystery breathes best. Fringe interpreters sometimes look at the long reigns and wonder whether they encode memories of non-human rulers, altered lifespans, lost cycles of time, or ancient dynasties misunderstood by later scribes. Such readings move far beyond secure evidence. They are not accepted as historical conclusions. Yet the fascination is understandable because the text itself creates a problem. It asks you to imagine authority before the flood, before ordinary chronology, before the human story becomes manageable. Perhaps the numbers were never meant as literal biography. Perhaps they were meant to make ordinary time bend. In Mesopotamian thought, the flood often marks a great division. Before it, the world feels vast, remote, and strangely ordered. After it, kingship resumes, but the scale changes. Reigns shrink toward human proportions. Cities still compete for sacred authority, but the age before the flood feels like another register of existence, a world remembered through distance. This does not mean the Sumerians were preserving a secret archive of a vanished super-civilization. It means they understood memory as layered, and they allowed sacred history to stretch where ordinary memory failed. The impossible numbers may be a way of protecting the oldness of kingship from being reduced to a recent invention. You walk now toward Shurpak in the mind, the city associated with the flood survivor in Mesopotamian tradition. The air is pale with dust. Mud brick walls catch the low sun. Somewhere, a potter turns clay. Somewhere else, a child learns signs by copying them badly, as children have always done with important things. The ordinary world continues around a memory of catastrophe. The king list places Shurpak near the edge of the flood. That placement matters. It does not prove that one specific worldwide deluge ended the age of the antediluvian kings. Archaeology points instead to many local and regional flood events across Mesopotamia, some severe, some remembered, some possibly folded into myth. Rivers in the alluvial plain could change lives violently. Water could erase houses, fields, graves, and records in a single season. For people dependent on irrigation and settlement, flood was not decoration, it was existential. A flood could become a boundary in memory. Before the waters, after the waters. Human cultures often divide time around disaster. A city burns, and people speak of before the fire. A kingdom falls, and records begin again under new names. A river changes course, and the old settlement becomes a mound. Over generations, the boundary can grow sacred. The historical event becomes a cosmic reset. The lived trauma becomes a myth of creation, judgment, or renewal. The Sumerian king list may be doing something like that. It preserves a world before a rupture, then resumes the sequence afterward. The rupture is not just a dramatic event, it organises memory. It allows the text to say that kingship survived catastrophe, even if the earlier world became unreachable. That is a powerful claim for a society that built legitimacy through continuity. Yet the list also raises a softer question. If the flood marks forgetting, what exactly was forgotten? Was it older political memory, reduced to impossible numbers? Was it a memory of early cities and sacred sites whose true histories had already become cloudy? Was it the echo of environmental disasters retold until they became the dividing line between human ages? Or was it, as some have wondered, a hint that the people who wrote these traditions believed humanity had inherited a broken story from those who came before them? The text does not say, its silence has shape. You can see the scribe copying the sequence with careful attention, perhaps not troubled by the impossible rains in the way a modern reader is troubled. Ancient time did not need to obey modern expectations. Sacred antiquity could measure differently. A king before the flood could rule for an immense span because he belonged to a time when the world was closer to divine order, closer to origin, closer to powers that later humanity could only remember in fragments. The Anunnaki hover near that sense of remoteness. They are not the subject of every line, but the world of the list belongs to the same broad imagination in which rule, destiny, cities, and divine authority are intertwined. Kingship descends. Cities receive it. Catastrophe interrupts it. History resumes, changed, but not severed. The divine order remains above the human sequence like a sky full of unseen offices. This is why the list feels important to the larger question of beginnings. It suggests that the earliest written memory did not imagine human civilization as a clean, recent invention. It imagined power coming down from a higher order, settling in cities, surviving a flood, and continuing through broken time. Even if that is theology, it is theology with memory inside it. And memory, when pressed into clay, can become almost as strange as prophecy. The lamp burns lower. The king names continue. Their reigns stretch across the darkness. Too long to be history, too organized to be dismissed, too damaged to be solved. You do not force them into certainty. You let them remain what they are, an ancient attempt to place human rule inside a timeline that begins before ordinary human remembering. Outside, the river moves in its channel. The city sleeps on older cities, and kingship, once written as something that descended from heaven, waits in clay with numbers no human life can hold. The river carries you toward Eridu again, but not as a name on a tablet. Now it feels like a low mound under a pale sky, a place where the earth has been opened carefully and history appears in layers. Eridu is not loud. Its power is not the power of spectacle. It is the quieter authority of depth, the feeling that something was remembered there for so long that the remembering became part of the soil. In Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu was often treated as astonishingly ancient. It was linked with Enki, the wise god of fresh waters craft, cunning and hidden knowledge. His watery domain, the Abzu, was not simply a pool or a river. It was the deep, sweet water beneath the earth, the life-giving source under the dry surface of the world. To people living in a southern Mesopotamia, where irrigation could mean survival, such a divine image was not abstract poetry, it was practical wonder. Fresh water was fate. The temple at Eridu seems to have been rebuilt many times across long periods. Archaeologists found a sequence of sacred buildings stacked one upon another, each newer phase resting over older remains. The earliest levels reach back into the Ubaid period, long before the great literary tablets from which many later myths survive. That is one of Eridu's most important grounded details. Its sacred importance did not begin with writing. Writing arrived late to a place already sacred. You stand near the excavation in the mind, with white light falling over baked earth and broken brick. The wind is dry. Fine dust gathers at the edge of every trench. Small pottery fragments lie in the soil like dull teeth. Somewhere beyond the site, the old marshlands would once have shimmered, full of reeds, fish, birds, insects, and the slow breath of water. The silence is wide. It is easy to understand why later memory might place wisdom here. The earliest shrines at Eridu were modest compared with later monumental temples, yet their repeated rebuilding suggests continuity of sacred attention. People returned to the same place. They maintained it. They raised new walls over old ones. They treated the location as meaningful before they could explain that meaning in surviving texts. Archaeology can show repetition, care, and construction. It cannot fully recover the first prayer whispered there. That missing prayer is where uncertainty enters. Scholars continue to debate how to interpret the earliest temple levels. Were they temples in the later sense, or communal ritual buildings that developed into temple institutions over time? How centralized was authority in those early communities? How much of later Sumerian theology can safely be projected backward into the Ubaid world? These questions are not small technicalities. They shape how far memory can travel. The deep past resists simple ownership. Later Sumerians could remember Eridu as first, wise, and sacred. Modern archaeology can confirm that Eridu was very old and richly significant. But between those two facts lies a long darkness where meanings changed, rites evolved, and old practices were absorbed into new stories. Still, a curious pattern remains. In later myths, Enki is not merely powerful, he is clever, technical, and deeply associated with the structures that make civilization possible. He knows crafts, he knows words, he knows the hidden ways beneath appearances. He's often less like a distant, thunderous force and more like a keeper of systems. He belongs to water, but also to knowledge. He is ancient wisdom given personality. That is why some speculative readers linger over Eridu. They imagine it not simply as a city, but as a memory point, a place where culture was received from mysterious teachers, divine engineers, or beings later folded into the language of gods. This is not a conclusion supported by archaeology in a direct way. The safer reading sees Eridu as a long-lived sacred centre whose prestige grew naturally through age, ritual, and association with freshwater power. Yet the symbolic force is undeniable. A city tied to the deep waters, a god tied to wisdom, a temple sequence older than writing, a tradition that treats sacred powers as things that can be held, transferred, and guarded. These elements gather like reeds along the same bank. You move closer to the imagined shrine. The bricks are sun-dried, uneven, handmade. Nothing about them suggests perfection. They are human objects shaped by fingers and habit. Yet when they are stacked into a sacred platform, they become part of a cosmic map. The god has a house. The community has a centre. The old place receives another layer. This repeated rebuilding is a quiet attention peak. A sacred site can remember longer than a text. A tablet may break. A language may die. A dynasty may vanish. But if a community keeps returning to the same patch of earth, building and rebuilding there, the place itself becomes a kind of archive. Not an archive of words, but of gestures, feet arriving, hands placing offerings, builders aligning walls, priests maintaining continuity, children learning that this mound is not like other mounds. Place becomes memory before writing becomes memory. At Eridu, that older memory is especially tempting because later texts place the city near the beginning of kingship and civilization. The king list names Eridu as the first city to receive kingship before the flood. Whether this reflects historical priority, theological prestige, or a later political vision remains debated. But the claim is powerful. It tells you that Mesopotamian memory looked toward Eridu when imagining the first ordering of human rule. Not everyone agrees on why. Some see Eridu's firstness as a memory of genuine early importance in southern Mesopotamia. Some emphasize its cultic prestige and the later theological power of Enki. Some treat its place in tradition as symbolic, a way of rooting civilization in wisdom and fresh water rather than military force. The truth may involve all of these things, layered together like the temple mound itself. That layering is important. The oldest beginnings are rarely single. They are built from ecology, ritual, power, memory, and story. Eridu may have been first in one sense, sacred in another, remembered as first in a later sense, and transformed again by scribes who inherited its name as a symbol of wisdom. The difficulty is not that the evidence says nothing. It says many partial things at once. You rest in that complexity for a while. The sun drops lower over the plain. The heat begins to loosen. Reeds near the marsh edge whisper against one another. A bird calls once, then disappears into the white sky. The air smells of clay, salt, and slow water. In the distance, workers return along a path with tools over their shoulders. Their world is entirely human, and yet everything in it seems tied to divine arrangement. The shrine stands because hands built it. The shrine matters because memory chose it. This is where the question of human beginnings becomes more subtle. Maybe the Sumerian texts were not trying to preserve a literal map of the first civilization. Maybe they were preserving a feeling of received order, the belief that human life had been shaped by powers older than any living community. Eridu gave that feeling a home. Enki gave it a voice. The Abzu gave it depth. A fringe reading might ask whether the deep water is more than water, whether it symbolizes an underground source of knowledge, a hidden archive, or a memory of teachers emerging from beyond ordinary human society. A cautious reading says that water, wisdom, and survival naturally joined in the imagination of people who depended on canals and marshes. Both readings circle the same image from different distances. Neither exhausts it. The oldest Eridu remains just beyond reach. You can dig through walls, but not through vanished meanings. You can date layers, compare pottery, study architecture, and map the growth of settlement. You can read later hymns and myths that make the place sacred. Yet somewhere between the first mud brick shrine and the later written memory of Enki, there is a gap where human voices have become too faint. That gap is not empty, it is full of waiting. As the last light fades, Eridu feels less like an answer than an invitation. It tells you that before the tablets name the beginning, people were already building sacred centres. Before scribes wrote of divine wisdom, communities had already gathered around places where wisdom would later be said to dwell. Before history could remember itself clearly, memory had already begun choosing where to stand. The mound darkens. The old bricks cool. And beneath the dry surface, the imagined waters of the Abzu remain hidden, carrying the soft suggestion that every beginning may rest upon something deeper than it can explain. From the deep water of Eridu, the story turns toward clay, not the clay of tablets now, but the clay of bodies, the damp earth from which human beings are imagined into life. In Mesopotamian creation traditions, humanity does not always begin with a shining command or a sudden breath in an empty world. Often, the beginning feels more like craft, mixture, decision, and necessity. Someone must shape the human form. Someone must decide why it exists. That second question is the more unsettling one. You find yourself in a dim mythic workshop, though the image must be held gently. No single surviving text gives one perfect Sumerian account that solves everything. The traditions are layered, with Sumerian and Akkadian materials speaking across time. Yet a pattern appears in several Mesopotamian stories. Humans are made in connection with labour. They are formed to relieve divine burden, maintain offerings, and keep the ordered world functioning. It is not a comforting origin, it is a practical one. In the Atrahasis tradition, the lesser gods grow exhausted from work. They dig, carry, and maintain the world until unrest rises among them. The divine order faces a labour crisis. The solution is the making of humans, created so they can take up the work that has become too heavy for the gods. The surviving version is Akkadian, and later than the earlier Sumerian period. But its themes fit deeply within Mesopotamian ideas about service, temples, and cosmic maintenance. The world needs workers. The gods need quiet. Humanity enters as an answer. This is one of the strangest differences between many modern expectations and the old Mesopotamian mood. People today often want an origin story that places humanity at the centre of meaning, beloved, unique, and crowned with purpose. These myths give humanity purpose, but not always tenderness. Humans are necessary because the system requires maintenance. They are valuable because they serve. A gentle sarcasm almost writes itself here. Apparently, even the cosmos had staffing problems. But the humour fades quickly, because the idea is profound. Ancient people living under kings, temple obligations, irrigation schedules, ration systems, and endless labour may have seen work not as an accident of society, but as woven into existence itself. The canal must be cleared because the land depends on it. Grain must be measured because households depend on it. Offerings must be brought because the gods depend on them, and because the city depends on the gods. The myth gives cosmic shape to daily fatigue. You can feel the worker's hand inside the story. The hand that cuts reeds, the hand that lifts mud, the hand that presses clay into bricks and carries them under white heat, the hand that grinds barley until the wrist aches, the hand that receives a ration and hopes it is enough. In such a world, to say humans were made for labour is not simply bleak. It is recognition. It tells the listener that toil is not a personal failure. It belongs to the structure of the world. Every basket carried beneath the sun echoes something older, something explained through gods because ordinary life needed sacred weight. Still, another question waits in the clay. Why would divine beings need relief at all? If gods are gods, why do they tire? Why do they dig, carry, complain, and rebel? Why does the divine world begin not in perfect serenity, but in strain? Scholars usually explain this through social imagination. The gods are pictured through human institutions and human experiences. Divine labour mirrors human labour. Divine hierarchy mirrors human hierarchy. Myth translates society into cosmic drama. That explanation is careful and persuasive, yet it does not remove the strangeness. The gods in these stories are not distant abstractions. They are embedded in systems of production, obligation, and conflict. They have councils, they negotiate, they face consequences. They do not create humanity because nothing existed. They create humanity because something already exists and is under pressure. That is a quiet attention peak. Creation is not the first event. It is a management decision. Some fringe interpreters have built entire theories from that idea. They suggest the myths may preserve a distorted memory of an older ruling group, perhaps remembered as gods, who shaped or organized early humans for labor. This reading is speculative and should be treated with caution. The texts do not provide physical proof of such a scenario. They belong to ancient religious literature, not laboratory records or modern testimony, but the image lingers because it is so specific. Humans are fashioned to perform tasks. Divine beings are relieved of work. Order continues. A cautious middle path might say that the myth preserves an ancient awareness of dependency. Humans depend on the gods for reign, fertility, order, and legitimacy. The gods, in turn, depend on humans for worship, offerings, and the maintenance of temples. This reciprocal system may not be equal, but it is mutual. The divine household needs servants, and the servants need the divine household not to collapse. The relationship is tense. It is intimate. It is not simple love. In some Mesopotamian creation imagery, clay is mixed with divine substance or life-giving material. Different traditions vary, and the details must not be blended carelessly. Yet the broader idea is striking. Humanity is formed from earth, but not merely earth. Something sacred, dangerous, or divinely connected enters the mixture. The human being becomes a boundary creature, low like mud, yet carrying a trace of higher power. You touch your own hand in the darkness of the story. Skin, warmth, pulse, breath, clay with memory. The old image is not scientific, but it is emotionally exact. Humans belong to earth. Bodies return to dust. Yet humans also remember, speak, build, worship, rebel, and ask why they exist. The Mesopotamian myths seem to understand this tension. Humanity is humble material given an impossible burden to serve gods, maintain order, endure mortality, and somehow carry memory forward. There is an open debate here that never fully closes. How much of these myths reflects actual social structure? How much reflects ritual theology? How much preserves older oral traditions whose first meanings are lost? When a text says humans were made for divine labor, is it explaining temple service, agricultural toil, kingship, mortality, or all of these at once? The strongest answer may be layered. Myth rarely means only one thing. You now hear the sounds of work at dawn. A wooden door creaks. Sandals scrape on hard earth. Someone coughs near a hearth. A child fusses while a mother ties a cord around a bundle. A man lifts a hoe, still half asleep. The river glimmers beyond the fields, beautiful and demanding. The canal bank waits to be repaired. The temple kitchen waits for grain. The city wakes into obligation. In that ordinary morning, the creation myth feels less remote. It feels like explanation breathed through tired bodies. A scribe copying such a story may not have wondered whether humans were literally moulded in one divine chamber. He may have understood the deeper truth as his culture gave it to him. Humans exist in service. The gods arranged the world. Labor is ancient. The city survives because everyone, visible and invisible, performs a role. Yet the broken edges of the tradition leave room for unease. If humanity was made to remember its task, was it also made to forget something else? Was the beginning softened into myth because the direct memory was too old, too sacred, or too dangerous to hold plainly? Or is forgetting simply what time does, turning practical origins into divine stories until the first reasons disappear? The clay does not answer. It only receives the mark. By evening, the workers return with dust on their skin. Smoke rises again. Offerings are prepared. Somewhere in the temple, the god is fed in ritual form. Somewhere in a school, a student presses signs into a practice tablet, learning the shapes that will carry old stories beyond his lifetime. The human purpose in these myths is not glorious in a simple way. It is smaller, heavier, and more haunting. To be human is to be formed from the earth, placed inside an order already older than oneself, and asked to carry a burden whose first giver has become difficult to name. The old stories may not reveal a hidden truth in the loud sense. They may reveal something quieter about memory itself, that people often remember their origins through the work they cannot escape. The night settles over the fields, the clay darkens beside the river, and the first human shape, still damp in the imagination, seems to wait for a name, a duty, and a forgetting that has already begun. The burden does not vanish when humanity receives it. It changes hands. That is the quiet discomfort inside the Atrahasis tradition. The gods are relieved, but the world is not healed. Work continues. Noise rises. Human beings multiply, labour, eat, speak, argue, sing, suffer, and fill the ordered world with the restless sound of life. The solution creates another problem. The divine system gains workers, but also inherits human disturbance. This is not a simple creation story. It is a story about consequences. You listen to it as if it were being recited in a low room, the walls warmed by oil lamps. Outside, the city has gone dark, but not silent. Dogs bark. Reeds scrape against a roof edge. Someone shuts a wooden door, somewhere. A baby cries, and the sound crosses the courtyard like a tiny complaint against the universe. In Atrahasis, human noise becomes one of the great tensions. The god Enlil, associated with authority, wind, and command, is disturbed by humanity's growing clamour. The text moves through attempts to reduce the human population through hardship, famine, and disease, before reaching the flood. The details are ancient, severe, and strange, yet they are not empty cruelty in the narrative's logic. They express anxiety about balance. Too much life becomes disorder. Too much sound troubles heaven. This is one of those details that feels almost too human to ignore. The gods create humans to solve a labour problem, then complain because humans become noisy. A modern listener may smile at the cosmic impatience. Anyone who has lived near a busy street may understand Enlil more than expected. Still, beneath that faint humour is a serious pattern. Mesopotamian myth often imagines the world as something that must be regulated. Fertility, work, population, water, kingship, and divine favour all require balance. The gods do not merely bless life. They manage it. The mainstream historical value of this tradition is rich. It helps us understand how Mesopotamian cultures thought about human mortality, divine authority, social pressure, and the fragility of survival. Floodplains can be generous, but they can also become overwhelming. Cities need people, but too many people constrain food, water, space, and order. Myths transform those pressures into divine drama. A drought becomes a judgment. A plague becomes a decision. A flood becomes a reset. Yet the story does something more subtle. It suggests that humanity's purpose is not simply to exist, but to exist within limits. Human beings must labour, worship, reproduce, and continue the city. But they must not overwhelm the divine order that made them useful. Their life is wanted and unwelcome at the same time. That contradiction is quietly unsettling. You can feel it in the body. To be created for work is one burden. To be punished for becoming too alive is another. The myth seems to say that human existence itself is excessive unless contained by ritual, death, hierarchy, and divine decree. Mortality becomes part of the system, not merely a tragedy outside it. Scholars have long discussed how the Atrahasis story relates to flood traditions elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature, including the flood episode later woven into the Epic of Gilgamesh. The surviving texts differ in language, date, and emphasis, and the relationships among them remain complex. Some lines are broken, some episodes are clearer in one tradition than another. The larger pattern is visible, but the original shape of the story cannot be recovered with complete confidence. The clay gives a framework. It withholds the first voice. That uncertainty is important because modern readers often want one clean version of the ancient flood story. The actual record is more patient and more frustrating. There are Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, different names for the survivor, different theological emphases, and different contexts of preservation. The flood is not one object. It is a current moving through many channels. Atrahasis is especially powerful because it places the flood inside a wider problem of creation, labor, population, and divine exhaustion. It does not treat catastrophe as a random storm. It treats catastrophe as part of a debate over humanity's place in the world. That is the attention peak hidden in the tradition. The flood is not only punishment, it is population control in sacred language. Handled carelessly, that idea can sound harsh. Handled slowly. It reveals how deeply ancient people connected cosmic order with human limits. In a world where harvests failed, rivers rose, and disease moved without explanation, the idea that life itself needed divine regulation may have felt grimly reasonable. The myth gives fear a structure. It makes suffering part of a system, even if that system is frightening. Here the speculative edge grows darker but remains quiet. Some fringe interpreters wonder whether such stories encode memories of controlled human development, deliberate population management, or intervention by beings later called gods. They point to the practical tone of divine decisions: create workers, reduce noise, impose limits, preserve one survivor. This reading is far beyond established scholarship. It should not be treated as confirmed history. Yet the text does give the imagination certain shapes to work with. The gods deliberate, humans are managed, a selected survivor carries memory across catastrophe. Those patterns are not inventions of modern mystery alone. They are present in the ancient narrative, though their meaning remains debated. A cautious reading sees social and environmental wisdom beneath the myth. Communities living in southern Mesopotamia knew that survival depended on balance. Too little water, and fields died. Too much water, and homes dissolved. Too few workers, and canals failed. Too many mouths, and grain stores thinned. The divine story may reflect ecological reality transformed into sacred drama. That reading has weight. It also has tenderness. People who lived close to the river understood that creation was never finished. Every season required repair. Every generation inherited tasks. Every flood threatened to undo what hands had made. In such a world, myths about divine burden and human burden were not distant philosophy. They were a way of naming the precariousness of being alive. You hear the city before dawn now. Not the grand city of kings and walls, but the working city. Someone pours water into a jar. A donkey stamps in its pen. A woman shakes grain into a bowl. A man touches the packed earth outside his door and looks at the sky, reading clouds without calling it science. The temple kitchens begin to stir. Smoke slips upward in blue threads. All this life makes sound. All this sound rises. In the mythic imagination, heaven hears it. The strange question is whether humanity was supposed to remember why it was made, or only remember the rituals that kept the arrangement stable. A worker may know his task without knowing the origin of the task. A priest may repeat a rite whose first reason has become sacred tradition. A scribe may copy a myth that explains human labour, while the actual social memory behind it has already faded beyond recovery. This is how forgetting can hide inside remembrance. A culture may preserve the story and lose the event. It may preserve the ritual and lose the first fear. It may preserve the divine names and lose the historical faces, if there ever were historical faces behind them. Atrahasis does not tell you that humans were never meant to remember the beginning. It suggests something more indirect, and perhaps more haunting. The beginning is shown as a divine decision made above the human level, in a council where humans are not yet present to witness it. Humanity enters after the plan has been made. By definition, humans cannot remember the meeting that created them. They can only inherit the story. That is a very old form of distance. You sit with that thought while the lamps fade. The clay tablet rests somewhere between literature and wound. It tells of labour, noise, divine annoyance, and the narrowing of life through mortality and catastrophe. It reflects ancient society. Yes, it reflects floodplain anxiety. Yes, it reflects theology, ritual, and the hard wisdom of survival. But it also leaves a question. If humanity was created inside a system already in motion, then the true beginning belongs to those who made the decision, not those who carried the burden. The human role begins after the hidden debate. Memory begins late. Work begins immediately. The city wakes fully now. Feet move through dust. The river waits beyond the fields, calm for the moment, as if it has never swallowed anything. The gods, in the old story, have withdrawn into their high places. Humans remain below, noisy, necessary, and mortal, carrying the work of a world they did not design. And somewhere in the clay, the forgotten burden continues to press its shape into every line. Sometimes the most powerful part of an ancient tablet is not what it says. It is where it stops. A line begins with confidence. A god speaks. A king acts. A city receives a decree. A human survivor hears a warning. Then the clay breaks. The rest is gone. A modern edition may mark the damage with brackets, dots, or cautious restorations, but those signs only make the absence more visible. The missing words become a dark room inside the record. You lean close to one such break. The surface is chipped where the story should continue. A corner has crumbled. A row of wedge marks ends in roughness. Perhaps the missing piece once carried a motive, a name, a warning, or the reason a divine decision changed. Perhaps it carried only a repeated phrase or a line of ordinary transition. You cannot know. That is the trouble. The imagination rushes toward the gap, while careful scholarship holds it back by the sleeve. The broken edge teaches patience. It also teaches humility. In Mesopotamian studies, fragmentary texts are a daily reality. Tablets break because clay is durable, but not invincible. Some were never baked intentionally. Some were hardened by fire when buildings burned. Some cracked in antiquity. Some were damaged during excavation, transport, storage, or earlier collecting. A tablet that seems ancient and stable behind glass may have survived through accidents no one planned. Survival is not the same as selection by wisdom. Sometimes the universe kept the receipt and lost the poem. That small, dry thought matters more than it first appears. When people build grand theories from ancient texts, they often forget how uneven the evidence is. One passage may survive in multiple copies, while another is known from a single broken fragment. One myth may appear in a later school tablet, while its older form is missing. One divine name may be clear, while the verb beside it is damaged. The result is a record full of islands. Between them lies water. You walk through an imagined tablet room now. Not a grand sacred archive, but a working space full of clay, dust, shelves, baskets, and quiet concentration. Some tablets are damp and newly written, others are dry and stacked. A few are discarded exercises, marked by students still learning their signs. There are lists of words, lists of professions, lists of gods, lists of animals, and lists of materials that once mattered enough to be written down. List after list. The ancient mind loved order, or at least ancient institutions did. A lexical list may seem boring until you realize what it means. Scribes were training memory. They grouped the world into categories and signs. They preserved names of trees, stones, tools, cities, gods, stars, and occupations. Such lists were not stories, but they shaped the people who could write stories. They taught scribes how reality could be arranged on clay. That is a grounded detail with quiet force. Before a myth becomes literature, writing itself becomes discipline. The reed stylus does not merely record memory, it shapes memory. It teaches which words belong together, which names must be copied correctly, which old formulas deserve repetition. The scribe becomes a gatekeeper without needing to hide anything. He preserves by choosing what to copy. He forgets by not copying. He changes the future by making a clean tablet from a damaged one. perhaps restoring a word according to what he thinks must have been there. Memory is never passive. Even in clay, it is edited. This is where the mystery of the broken tablet becomes more than physical damage. Some gaps are accidental, caused by time, weather, and breakage. Other gaps may be cultural. Stories that were never written down are gone from the record. Ritual words kept orally may have vanished. Local traditions may have been absorbed into larger myths. Uncomfortable meanings may have been softened by later copyists. More often, no one was plotting. People simply copied what their school, temple, city, or tradition considered worth preserving. Forgetting can be ordinary. That may be the strangest thing of all. The unusual fringe tidbit here is not a single forbidden tablet, but the possibility that entire layers of early memory were filtered before writing became widespread. Some speculative readers imagine scribal schools as guardians of hidden knowledge about the Anunnaki, creation, and the first human order. That idea is attractive, but evidence for deliberate secrecy is difficult to prove. What we can say more safely is that scribal culture controlled access to written memory. Literacy was specialized. Texts circulated through institutions. Not everyone could read the world's official past. The beginning was never equally available. You can feel how that changes the question. If only certain people could copy, teach, preserve, and interpret sacred stories, then human memory of origins passed through trained hands. Those hands might be sincere, careful, devout, political, tired, ambitious, or all of these at different moments. A student copying a creation myth may preserve a phrase without understanding its oldest resonance. A master may correct him according to a tradition already centuries old. A city may prefer the version in which its own god appears central. The path narrows as it travels. Scholars continue to debate how stable ancient oral and written traditions were across time. Some formulas endured with remarkable strength. Other stories shifted as they moved between Sumerian and Akkadian, temple and school, city and empire. Translation itself was not a neutral glass. It was interpretation. A Sumerian divine concept rendered in Akkadian could carry new associations. A later copy might preserve old language in a world that understood it differently. The tablet breaks. The meaning shifts. The reader arrives late. This is a quiet attention peak worth holding carefully. A missing line can create a mystery, but a surviving line can also mislead if it is treated as complete. Ancient texts often come to us like a melody heard through a wall. You catch enough to follow the tune, but not enough to know every instrument. A sudden silence may be a lost verse, or simply the wall growing thicker. The temptation is to fill the silence with certainty. The better path is to listen longer. You return to the broken edge. The clay is rough where the missing portion fell away. The damage is not dramatic. It is just absence made visible. But in a story about why humans may not remember the beginning, absence itself becomes almost meaningful. The human origin, in many Mesopotamian traditions, is decided among gods before human witnesses exist. The record of that decision then survives through later scribes, damaged tablets, and partial copies. At every stage, distance increases. Humans are late to their own origin. The text is late to the story. You are late to the text. Each layer adds fog. One cautious reading might suggest that the Sumerian and Mesopotamian records do not claim humanity was forbidden to remember the beginning in a simple way. Instead, they show a world in which the beginning belongs to divine administration, priestly preservation, and scribal reconstruction. Humans inherit the explanation, but not the event. They receive the duty, but not full access to the first decision. This is not conspiracy, it is structure. You sit in the tablet room as night thickens. The scribe's lamp burns with a small, steady flame. Wax, smoke, and oil smell faintly in the air. The stylus lies beside a damp tablet, its cut reed tip stained with clay. Outside, footsteps fade from the courtyard. Inside, a line waits to be copied. Perhaps it is copied correctly. Perhaps it is shortened. Perhaps the original behind it was already broken. A small insect taps against the lamp. The scribe pauses, rubs his wrist, and looks down at the old exemplar. A sign is unclear. He hesitates. In that hesitation, the future changes by the width of a wedge. The broken tablet does not shout its secret. It teaches that memory is made of survival, choice, accident, and loss. It reminds you that ancient beginnings come to us through hands that did not know us, through institutions that had their own purposes, through clay that endured and clay that vanished. The missing line remains missing. The silence keeps its place, and somewhere inside that silence, the reason for the first human burden may have slipped beyond the reach of every later reader. The broken line draws you toward Nippur, not because Nippur answers everything, but because it understands the power of keeping things. In the memory of ancient Mesopotamia, Nippur was not always the richest city, or the most glamorous to modern imagination, but it held a particular sacred weight. It was strongly associated with Enlil, one of the great powers of command, atmosphere, authority, and destiny. A city can become a center without ruling everything. Nippur was one of those places. You enter it softly, through dust and late light. The streets are not silent, but the sound feels contained by mud brick walls. Donkeys move under loads. A man carries reeds over his shoulder. A woman steps from a doorway with a jar pressed to her hip. Somewhere, grain is being measured. Somewhere else, students are trying to copy signs neatly enough to please a teacher who has seen every lazy wedge before. The air smells of clay, wool, oil, and sun-warmed brick. Above the city's ordinary life, sacred authority gathers. Enlil's temple at Nippur, known as the Eka, was one of the most important religious centers in southern Mesopotamia. Kings from different cities and periods sought legitimacy through connection with Nippur and its god. To restore or honor the sanctuary was not only a pious act, it was a political statement. A ruler who respected Enlil's house placed himself inside a larger order than his own ambition. That is a grounded detail worth resting beside. Power needed memory. Memory needed institutions. Nippur was also a major scribal center. Excavations there produced large numbers of tablets, including school texts, lexical lists, hymns, myths, and administrative records. This does not mean that every ancient secret was locked there in some hidden chamber. The truth is more ordinary and more interesting. Nippur helped preserve, teach, copy, and transmit learned tradition across generations. It was, in a sense, a sacred filing room, not a modern archive with clean labels and quiet climate control. Of course, imagine instead rooms full of clay tablets, baskets, shelves, fragments, dust, students, teachers, and the smell of damp earth. Imagine old compositions copied because they mattered, because they trained the hand, because they shaped the mind, because the city's place in the sacred order depended partly on remembering correctly. A tablet could be a lesson could be a worldview. This is where the idea of controlled memory becomes subtle. No one needs to imagine a secret society whispering in darkness. The ordinary structure of literacy already creates boundaries. Most people in the ancient city could not read complex literary Sumerian. Most could not walk into a scribal school and interpret myths, hymns, an old list for themselves. Written memory was specialized, taught, disciplined, and connected to institutions. The past had custodians. That fact does not make the custodians sinister. It makes them powerful. A scribe in training might begin with simple signs, then move toward lists, proverbs, model contracts, hymns, and older compositions. Sumerian itself remained important in scribal culture even after Akkadian became widely spoken. This created a remarkable situation. Students learned to copy and understand a prestigious ancient language that was no longer everyday speech for many communities. The past became a skill. To remember properly, you had to be trained. That is a quiet attention peak. Origins were not merely told around a fire. Some were preserved through education, correction, memorization, copying, and institutional discipline. A story about creation, divine order, or kingship could survive because generations of students pressed its words into clay under supervision. It is restful to picture, but also strange. The beginning of humanity might depend, in its surviving form, on whether a student completed his assignment. A little humility enters the room, perhaps also a little sympathy for the student. The scholarly uncertainty here is important. Researchers continue to debate how scribble schools functioned in different periods, how standardized curricula were, and how texts moved between temples, households, and other learning environments. The phrase scribal school can make things sound tidier than they were. Some learning may have happened in private houses. Some collections may reflect teaching, archiving, administration, or mixtures of all three. The evidence is rich, but not perfectly transparent. Still, the larger pattern is clear enough. Written tradition was cultivated. It did not simply float through society. It was held by people with tools, training, and social roles. In that sense, Nippur gives you a different way to think about forgetting. Not the forgetting caused by catastrophe, but the forgetting produced by selection. A culture remembers what it keeps copying. It loses what it stops teaching. A myth survives because it remains useful. A name survives because it remains sacred. A question disappears because no one writes it again. Here, the Anunnaki return as part of learned memory. They appear in texts whose transmission depends on scribes, teachers, and institutions. Their meanings shift across traditions, but their presence is preserved because divine classification mattered. The divine world could be named, sorted, praised, invoked, and studied. The gods were not only worshipped in ritual, they were also organized in lists and stories. To list a god is to place that god within order. To copy the list is to renew the order. Some speculative readers imagine that such divine lists preserve the faded structure of an older ruling hierarchy. Perhaps human, perhaps more than human, later mythologized as divine assembly. That is a fringe interpretation and cannot be established from the tablets alone. A more cautious view is that divine lists reflect theological system building, local cults, political changes, and scribal love of classification. Yet the result remains fascinating. The heavens become arranged like an archive. Names have ranks. Powers have relationships. Cities have patrons. Myths explain how authority moves. The learned world of Nippur does not dissolve the mystery. It gives the mystery shelves. You pause near a room where students copy by lamplight. Their tablets are not grand monuments. Some are clumsy, with signs too large or uneven. A teacher's correction may appear beside a student's attempt. There is something tender in this. The oldest stories of creation and divine order did not survive only through kings and priests. They also survived through practice, frustration, and repetition. Boy presses too hard into the clay. A girl, in some possible household setting, listens to an older relative recite a phrase. A teacher sighs. A line continues. The beginning becomes a curriculum. That thought changes the emotional texture of the question. If humans were never meant to remember the beginning, then why preserve any origin story at all? Perhaps because the story was not meant to reveal everything. Perhaps it was meant to teach position. Humans did not need to remember the divine council as witnesses. They needed to remember their place within the order that council produced. This reading is cautious but haunting. The surviving myths may offer not open access to the first moment, but structured memory of human duty. They tell who rules, who serves, who maintains offerings, who restores temples, who carries labour, and who must accept mortality. They remember enough to preserve obedience, identity, and continuity. They do not necessarily remember enough to restore the whole beginning. The archive keeps the usable past. The rest drifts. Outside, Nippur's night settles quietly over the echo. The temple walls hold the day's fading warmth. Somewhere, an offering vessel is washed. Somewhere, a tablet is placed beside others to dry. The city breathes through its alleys. and the stars appear above the flat roofs like small signs no scribe can quite impress into clay. You feel the old system surrounding you, not as a prison exactly, more as a vast arrangement of names, duties, gods, texts, and repetitions. Nippur does not tell you what happened at the first beginning. It shows you how beginnings are kept after they have become ancient. They are copied, they are taught, they are corrected, they are placed into the hands of those trained to read them. The lamps dim in the scribal room. The clay tablets wait in rows, and in that sacred filing room of memory, the beginning remains present, but carefully shaped, like a sentence copied so many times that no one can hear the first voice clearly anymore. The rows of tablets lead your attention to something smaller than a tablet, a seal. It rests in the hand like a little stone memory, smooth from use, carved with figures so tiny they seem to belong to another scale of seeing. A cylinder seal could be rolled across wet clay to leave an image and sometimes a name. In that rolling motion, identity became visible. Authority left a trace. A person, office, temple, or household could say, "This passed through my hand." The ancient world trusted impressions, not because people were innocent, but because systems needed marks. A sealed jar, door, tablet, or bundle could carry proof that someone had authorized, owned, checked, delivered, or received something. The seal did not merely decorate, it acted. It stood between trust and suspicion, between order and confusion. A seal was a small guardian. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals became one of the most distinctive objects of administrative and symbolic life. They were carved from stone, shell, or other materials, then worn, carried, inherited, or buried with their owners. Their images could show banquets, animals, contests, worshippers before gods, heroes struggling with beasts, and figures whose meanings are still debated. Some scenes are clear in function, others seem to glow with a symbolic language not fully recovered. This is where the small object opens into mystery. You picture a seal being rolled across a strip of damp clay. The carved design appears as a continuous scene, as if the stone were unrolling a hidden world. A seated god receives a worshipper. A horned crown marks divine status. A star, crescent, bird, staff, gate, or flowing vase may appear. The scene is both image and statement. It says who stands before whom. It says whose authority matters. It says which divine presence shelters the act. Identity is never alone. It is surrounded by signs. In a culture where names, offices, and divine relationships matter deeply, seals could tie human activity to sacred order. A transaction might seem ordinary. Grain moved, wool counted, oil delivered, labour assigned. Yet the impression on clay could place that ordinary act inside a world of gods, patrons, and legitimate authority. Administration and symbolism met in the same soft surface. This is one of the grounded details that makes Mesopotamia so fascinating. Everyday record keeping did not happen in a stripped secular vacuum. The economic, legal, religious, and visual worlds overlapped constantly. A seal could be practical and sacred without contradiction. It could secure property and display devotion. It could mark an official action and show a human figure approaching divine power. The clay received both. The unusual edge appears when you consider how often divine symbols appear as if they were official signs in a larger system. Horned crowns, standards, stars, winged forms, flowing waters, sacred animals, and enthroned figures create a visual vocabulary of power. Modern fringe readers sometimes wonder whether these symbols preserve memory of actual ranks, technologies, or beings later translated into divine imagery. That claim cannot be proven from the seals. The safer reading sees a rich symbolic system shaped by religion, politics, and artistic convention. Yet even the safe reading is strange enough. Symbols governed recognition. A person in the ancient city might not read a long myth, but he might recognize a divine symbol. She might know which god belonged to which city. A seal impression could communicate authority without needing a full spoken explanation. The world was full of visual shorthand for invisible power. That matters to the question of remembering the beginning. Memory does not survive only in stories. It survives in signs, gestures, and repeated images. A god symbol carved again and again may outlive the exact myth that first gave it meaning. A ritual pose may continue long after its first theological explanation has shifted. A seal scene may preserve the shape of divine encounter even when the original story behind the scene is lost. The image remembers after the sentence breaks. You move through an ancient storeroom where sealed clay tags hang from baskets and jars. The air is cool compared with the courtyard, scented with grain, dust, rope fibre, and old wood. A worker sets down a container. An official checks the mark. A scribe notes the amount. No one pauses to think that thousands of years later someone may study the impression and wonder what it meant. To them, it is daily order. To you, it is a coded world. Cylinder seals also raise scholarly uncertainties. Some scenes are difficult to interpret because the same motif may appear in different contexts. Is a figure a god, a priest, a king, a hero, or a mythic being? Does a strange object represent a standard, a tool, a plant, a weapon, a ritual item, or a symbol whose name is lost? Art historians compare styles, inscriptions, find spots, and parallels. But some images remain open to careful debate. The ancient picture refuses to become a caption. That refusal is important. A quiet attention peak appears in the act of sealing itself. A seal is not only an image, it is a repeated image produced by motion. The same stone can mark many pieces of clay. The same identity can appear across doors, tablets, jars, and contracts. It is almost like a portable memory machine, carrying a carved world from one soft surface to another. The owner moves, the image repeats, authority spreads. If ancient texts suggest that divine powers were assigned, transferred, or guarded, then seals show a similar logic at the human level. Offices, ownership, and obligations must be marked. Names must attach to actions. Without such marks, memory becomes too fragile for complexity. The seal helps the system remember who touched what, who approved what, and who belonged where. Now bring that thought softly toward the Anunnaki. Divine names and groups survive in texts, but divine order also lives through visual and ritual patterns. The Anunnaki are not usually reducible to a single seal image, and one should not force every horned figure into that category. Still, the broader culture that preserved their names also surrounded divine authority with symbols of rank, placement, and recognition. The gods had signs, their powers had images, their relationships could be suggested by position and gesture. The unseen world had a visual administration. That phrase feels strange, but fitting. It also brings you closer to the idea of sealed names. In ancient Mesopotamia, knowing and writing names had power. A name could identify, invoke, praise, curse, legitimize, or preserve. Royal inscriptions laboured to keep a king's name alive. Curse formulas warned future rulers not to erase it. Divine names were handled with reverence, precision, and tradition. To lose a name was to slip toward non-being. Forgetting was not neutral. It was dangerous. This is another place where the theme becomes quietly unsettling. If a memory required correct names, then an origin without names would become almost unreachable. A beginning whose actors were unnamed, renamed, or folded into divine categories would survive only as roles and symbols. The administrator, the judge, the maker, the wise one, the stormlord, the great assembly. Over time, the first faces would vanish behind offices. Some have wondered whether myth itself is a sealing process. It preserves a pattern while hiding the raw event beneath it. Like a cylinder seal rolling across clay, myth repeats an authorized image of the past. Each repetition is real, Each impression carries meaning, but the carved stone behind the impressions may remain partly unseen. This is speculative, of course, but it is a useful metaphor. A cautious reading keeps us grounded. Seals were tools of administration, identity, artistry, and devotion. Their symbolic worlds reflect the beliefs and institutions of the societies that made them. They do not prove that the gods were historical administrators from a forgotten age. They do show, however, that ancient people bound memory to material acts with extraordinary care. They sealed goods, they sealed promises, they sealed names into clay. The beginning, if preserved at all, may have been sealed in the same way, not hidden behind a modern conspiracy, enclosed inside forms that only made sense within the old order. You step outside the storeroom. The evening has cooled. A line of smoke rises beyond the temple wall. Someone washes clay from his hands in a shallow bowl. A seal hangs from a cord against an official's chest, no larger than a thumb, yet heavy with identity. When he walks, the carved stone taps softly against his garment. A small sound, a whole system. The old city depends on marks, seal marks, tablet marks, brick stamps, names, rituals, offerings, boundaries, lists. Each mark holds a piece of memory in place. Without them, the city would still breathe, but its obligations would blur, its authority would weaken, its past would begin to scatter. Perhaps that is why beginnings become so hard to recover. The first marks are gone, or they never existed in durable form. Later marks survive and point backward, but only indirectly. Divine symbols remain, names remain, scenes of approach, offering, power, and rank remain. They show a world deeply concerned with who has authority to stand where. The seal rests again in the palm. Its carved figures are still. But in the mind it rolls once more across wet clay, leaving behind a procession of gods, humans, symbols, and guarded names. The impression is clear. The source is smaller than expected. The meaning is partly lost, and somewhere behind the sealed image, the first name of the beginning remains unspoken. The seal impression fades, and the city returns to its routines. Grain moves from one room to another. Wool is weighed. Oil is poured. Workers receive rations. A priest checks an offering. A scribe records the amount with the calm seriousness of someone who knows that tomorrow another amount will need recording. Nothing appears dramatic. Yet this ordinary movement is where myth becomes administration. The sacred story enters the storeroom. That's one of the strangest and most grounded truths about Mesopotamian civilization. The gods were not only honoured in songs, they were also fed, clothed, housed, counted for, and served through daily institutional labour. Temples could own land, employ personnel, manage goods, receive offerings, and distribute resources. The divine household was not a metaphor only. It was a working economic reality with kitchens, workshops, fields, herds, and lists. A god had a house had staff. A staff needed records. This is where the boundary between belief and bureaucracy becomes soft. If a sheep is delivered to a temple, is that religious devotion, economic administration, royal duty, or local politics? The answer may be yes to all of them. A modern mind likes separate boxes. Ancient institutions often place the boxes inside one another, then seal them with clay. You walk into a temple courtyard in the pale light of morning. The ground is swept but dusty. A man carries a basket of dates. Another leads an animal by a cord. A woman brings woven cloth. The air smells of grain flour, warm brick, old smoke, and a faint sweetness from incense. Near a doorway, a scribe sits with a tablet balanced on his palm. The scene feels ordinary because it has to be ordinary. Sacred order depends on repetition. The remarkable part is that daily offerings helped make myth feel real. If a god was the city's patron, then the temple economy enacted that relationship every day. Food moved toward the divine house. Labour maintained the sacred space. Festivals renewed cosmic order. Priests performed rites whose meanings were both theological and practical. The city did not merely tell itself that the gods ruled. It organized life as if that rule required material care. This gives the old creation stories a new texture. When myths say humans were made to serve the gods, the idea does not float above life. It descends into kitchens, fields, storehouses, and canals. Service is not abstract. It is bread, beer, wool, oil, bricks, songs, cleaning, processions, and careful timing. The human purpose written in myth becomes the daily schedule of the city. And that is a quiet attention peak. Creation becomes a work roster. It may sound almost too plain, but the plainness is the point. In Mesopotamian thought, cosmic order was not maintained by belief alone. It required correct performance. The god statue had to be treated as a living presence in ritual contexts. Meals had to be offered. Ceremonies had to be timed. Buildings had to be repaired. Names had to be recited. Neglect was not just laziness. It was risk. The world could loosen. A scholarly uncertainty lies in how much ordinary people understood or experienced these systems. Administrative tablets show operations, but not inner feeling. Hymns give devotion, but not every worker's private thoughts. Ritual texts preserve procedure, but not always the emotional atmosphere. We can reconstruct institutions more easily than belief. We can see the movement of barley more clearly than the trembling of a person's heart. The clay counts better than it confesses. Still, the count itself tells a story. The temple world placed human labour under divine ownership. A worker receiving rations might be part of an economy that links survival to sacred order. A craftsman making a ritual object might participate in theology with his hands. A farmer maintaining a canal might be doing something both practical and cosmic, because water, grain, temple, city, and God all belong to one system of meaning. No wonder the gods in myth seem administrative. Administration was one of the ways divinity touched the ground. Some fringe interpretations take this very far. They suggest that temples were not only religious estates, but remnants of a managed human project whose original supervisors were later remembered as gods, or Anunnaki. In this reading, offerings become tribute, rituals become protocol, and myths become softened reports of ancient control. The idea is imaginative, but it goes beyond what the evidence can securely carry. A cautious reading remains strong. Temples reflect how ancient societies organized labor, wealth, legitimacy, and sacred obligation. Divine administration is likely a mirror of human administration, intensified by theology. Yet mirrors can still preserve real shapes. When a civilization imagines heaven as a hierarchy of offices and duties, it reveals how deeply order, labor, and memory ruled its world. You continue through the temple precinct. A storeroom lies in shade. Inside are jars with clay stoppers, baskets of grain, folded textiles, and perhaps tools awaiting use. The room is not grand, but it feels important. Sacred life depends on stored things. A festival without supplies becomes only longing. A god's house without offerings becomes a neglected symbol. A city without records forgets what it owes. Debt is a form of memory. So is offering. So is ritual. At certain times, statues of gods could be processed, dressed, presented, or moved according to ceremony. In later Mesopotamian traditions, divine images were not merely art objects. They could be treated as living embodiments of divine presence after elaborate rituals. This raises difficult questions for modern interpretation. How did ancient people understand the relationship between image and God? How literal was presence? How much varied between priestly theology and popular devotion? The evidence gives outlines, not complete interior life. Yet the effect is clear. The city's sacred centre was not passive. It acted through time. It received. It demanded. It remembered. It turned myth into schedule and schedule into memory. The temple became a machine for preserving order, though not a cold machine. It was full of scent. sound, gesture, food, music, fatigue, status, and fear of doing things wrongly. There is a strange tenderness in that. Human beings, made from clay and story, spent their lives moving clay, shaping clay, writing on clay, sealing clay, and building with clay for gods whose houses also rose from earth. The material world did not oppose the sacred. It carried the sacred in jars, bricks, tablets, floors, bowls, and hands. The Anunnaki, in this atmosphere, are less like isolated figures and more like part of a broad divine order that required maintenance, whether imagined as great gods, judges, or powers within a larger sacred assembly. Their world depends on structure. The human world below imitates that structure through temples, offerings, authority, and records. The beginning is remembered not through one dramatic revelation, but through endless acts of service. This may be why the question of forgotten origins feels so persistent. A system can preserve behaviour long after the first explanation fades. People may continue offering, copying, sealing, rebuilding, and obeying because the order itself has become sacred. The original reason may vanish, but the routine remains. In that sense, humanity might remember the beginning not as a story it fully understands, but as a pattern it keeps reenacting. You leave the storeroom as afternoon light settles into gold. A scribe smooths the edge of a tablet. A priest walks past with quiet purpose. Somewhere, someone laughs softly in a courtyard, reminding you that even sacred systems contain ordinary human moments. The temple is not only solemn, it is alive, busy, dusty, and dependent on many tired people doing necessary things. Myth has become administration. Administration has become memory. And memory, held in bowls of grain and rows of clay marks, continues to preserve a beginning that may no longer be explainable, only performed. The bowls of grain, the sealed jars, and the temple schedules all depend on one quiet hope. Tomorrow will arrive in the same world. That hope is never guaranteed in southern Mesopotamia. The rivers are generous, but they are not tame. They feed the fields, carry boats, fill canals, and make cities possible. They also rise without asking permission. They shift, spill, break banks, swallow houses, drown crops, and leave behind a silence filled with mud. The flood enters memory because water enters everything. You stand now beside a canal before dawn, when the air is cool and the reeds are black against the paling sky. Insects hum low near the waterline. A faint smell of wet clay rises from the bank. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then stops. The river looks calm enough to trust, which is exactly why it feels dangerous. A calm river remembers movement. Mesopotamian flood traditions are among the most haunting parts of the ancient record. They appear in different forms, with different names, languages, and theological accents. In one Sumerian tradition, the survivor is Ziusudra. In Akkadian traditions, related figures appear under other names, including Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. These stories are not identical, but they share a deep structure: divine decision, warning, vessel, overwhelming water, survival, sacrifice, and a changed human world. A disaster becomes a hinge. The grounded history here is important. Archaeology has found evidence of significant flood deposits at certain Mesopotamian sites, though not one uniform flood layer covering all cities at the same time. Scholars generally treat the flood stories as mythic traditions shaped by real experiences of riverine disaster, cultural memory, theology, and literary development. The floodplain made such stories believable because water truly could remake a community's world. A local catastrophe can become cosmic in memory. That does not make the story false in a simple sense. It makes it transformed. The ancient people did not need modern categories of local, regional, symbolic, and theological. A flood that destroyed your city could feel like the world ending, because for you, the world had ended. Your house, field, shrine, dead relatives, debts, tools, and childhood paths might all vanish beneath brown water. The earth itself would forget your shape. This is where flood becomes forgetting. Water does not only kill in myth, it erases boundaries. It softens mud brick back into mud. It carries away storage jars, tablets, walls, seeds, animals, names, and the arrangements that make life recognizable. A city after flood is not simply wet. It is uncertain. Who owns which field now? Which house stood where? Which record survived? Which ancestors can still be located beneath the ground? A flood attacks memory. That is the quiet attention peak. The Mesopotamian flood is not only a punishment, reset, or dramatic spectacle. It is a break in the archive of living. It divides time into what was known and what must be reconstructed. When later traditions place great change around the flood, they may be expressing a deep truth about how catastrophe rearranges memory. Before the flood, the world is remote. After the flood, the world must be rebuilt. The Sumerian king list famously uses the flood as a dividing marker. Kingship descends. Antediluvian kings rule for vast periods. The flood sweeps over, and kingship is found again in another city. Whether one reads this as theology, political memory, mythic structure, or all at once, the effect is powerful. The flood interrupts continuity, but does not destroy the idea of order. Kingship survives by relocating. Order floats through catastrophe. That image is almost too beautiful. A speculative reader might lean close and wonder whether the flood stories preserve a memory of an older human age deliberately ended, hidden, or reset by powers later called gods. Some have imagined that the Anunnaki withdrew, judged, or reorganized humanity through catastrophe. The tablets do not allow certainty here. They do not give modern proof of controlled destruction or secret historical engineering, but they do preserve a divine decision surrounding flood, and that decision remains troubling. The waters do not arrive alone. In the stories, they arrive through counsel, warning, secrecy, and selection. That selection matters. Not everyone remembers. One figure receives the warning. One household or chosen group survives. One line of memory passes through the waters while countless others disappear into silence. This is not only a survival story. It is a story about controlled transmission. The past after the flood depends on who was allowed to carry it. That thought is unsettling in a quiet way. If memory crosses catastrophe through one chosen vessel, then memory is already narrowed. The survivor remembers, but cannot remember everything. He carries a version of the world, not the whole world. The flood has reduced the human archive to what fits inside survival. A boat becomes a library. A family becomes a civilization's fragile thread. A ritual after landing becomes the first sentence of the changed world. Scholars continue to debate the relationships between flood traditions across Mesopotamia, including how Sumerian, Old Babylonian, and later versions influenced one another. They also debate how these stories relate to other flood narratives in the ancient Near East. Similarities are clear, but the history of transmission is complex. Stories travelled, changed languages, acquired new theology, and entered new literary frames. The flood itself keeps moving through texts. Like water, it takes the shape of each vessel. You walk now through the aftermath in imagination. The water is withdrawn, leaving mud on everything. A wall leans, a roof has collapsed. Clay tablets, if they survived, are caked with silt. Some may have been hardened by disaster. Others have dissolved into featureless earth. The smell is wet straw, dead reeds, sour grain, and opened ground. People move slowly because the familiar world has become unfamiliar. No one needs to say the old order is gone. The mud says it. This is one reason flood traditions may have carried emotional truth across generations. They do not only speak about divine anger, they speak about the terror of losing the pattern of life. The temple must be restored. The fields must be marked again. The dead must be remembered, if possible. The records must be remade. Children must be told what happened. and their children will receive the story in a changed voice. After enough generations, the voice becomes myth. The river becomes cosmic water. The lost neighborhood becomes the world before the flood. The old people become the people of a vanished age. If humans were not meant to remember the beginning, perhaps catastrophe helped ensure that they could not. Not because someone necessarily planned the forgetting, but because floods, time, and fragile materials are very efficient editors. Water erases without ideology. Silt covers without explanation. Later scribes can only preserve what still is a path into speech. Still, the myths frame the forgetting as more than accident. They place divine intention around the catastrophe. They suggest that gods debated, decided, concealed, and allowed survival through chosen warning. This is where responsible mystery can remain alive. The historical floodplain gives one layer. The literary divine counsel gives another. The human need to explain suffering gives another. The possibility of older memories hidden inside the story gives the final, dim layer. None cancels the others. They settle like silt. The sky darkens over the canal. Clouds gather in a low band beyond the plain. You hear the first wind move through reeds, then the soft tapping of rain on dry ground. For a moment, rain is blessing. For another, it is warning. The same water that gives fields their life can turn memory back into mud. The tablets know this, or rather, the people who made them knew. They lived in a world where beginnings could be buried, where a city could become a mound, where the official past might need to be written again after the waters withdrew. In that world, the flood was not just an event behind them. It was a pattern waiting at the edge of every season. The river moves in darkness. The bank holds for now, and somewhere inside the old flood story, the beginning slips farther away, carried not into nothing, but into a memory so broken that only a survivor, a sacrifice, and a few damp fragments remain. From the water, one figure remains. Not a conqueror, not a builder of monuments, not a king remembered for victory in the ordinary sense. He survives because someone is warned, because a message passes through secrecy, because a vessel is prepared while the rest of the world continues without understanding what is coming. In the Sumerian tradition, the name Ziusudra stands near that fragile crossing, a life stretched across forgetting. Ziusudra belongs to the old flood memory that later echoes through other Mesopotamian forms. He's not exactly the same as every later flood survivor, and the surviving Sumerian text is fragmentary. That is important. You do not meet him through a complete, polished doorway. You meet him through damaged clay, through missing lines, through a story that has lost parts of its own body. The survivor himself survives in fragments. That feels strangely appropriate. In the Sumerian flood story, as it is often called, the gods decide upon a flood, and the human survivor receives warning through divine intervention. The details are incomplete because the tablet is damaged, but the shape remains recognizable. A catastrophe comes. One man is preserved. Afterward, kingship and human life continue in a changed world. The story is less a full explanation than a dimly lit corridor. You walk down it slowly. The walls are wet with old water. What makes Ziusudra so haunting is not only that he survives, but that he survives with knowledge others lack. That is the burden of the warned person. He must act before proof appears. He must trust a message that separates him from everyone around him. He must prepare while ordinary life continues, while neighbors work, eat, complain, trade, and sleep beneath a sky that still looks normal. The warning isolates him. This is one of the quiet emotional centers of the flood tradition. Survival is not simply rescue. It is separation from the shared world. The person who receives the warning already lives partly in the future disaster. He hears the river differently. He sees clouds differently. He looks at the city and knows, or fears, that its familiar sounds may soon belong to memory. That is a heavy kind of knowing. The grounded historical detail remains clear. Mesopotamian flood narratives reflect a landscape where flooding was real, recurring, and culturally powerful. River systems shaped settlement, agriculture, and risk. Communities learned that water could both bless and erase. Stories about a chosen survivor may have grown from these environmental realities, then taken on theological and literary form across generations. But the story does not feel like weather alone. It feels like selection. Someone is allowed to remember. That thought gives the old myth its edge. If a flood erases a world, the survivor becomes the narrow gate through which the old world passes into the new one. He cannot carry every voice. He cannot preserve every household, dispute, song, prayer, joke, tool, and grief. He carries only what his body, vessel, memory, and ritual allow. Everything else becomes silt. The survivor is also an editor, not by choice, by survival. This is where some speculative readers pause over Ziusudra and related figures. They wonder whether the flood survivor represents a controlled handoff between human ages, a deliberate preservation of certain knowledge while other knowledge is allowed to disappear. In the boldest fringe readings, the gods or Anunnaki do not merely react to disaster, they manage what crosses the boundary. Such interpretations go beyond secure evidence and should be treated carefully. Yet the ancient story itself contains a gentler version of that pattern. Warning is not given to all, memory is not preserved equally. The future depends on a chosen transmission. Scholars continue to debate how the Sumerian flood account relates to the broader Mesopotamian flood tradition. The fragmentary condition of the text complicates certainty. Later Akkadian versions preserve fuller scenes, but they also belong to different literary and theological settings. Should missing parts of the Sumerian story be reconstructed by comparison with later texts? How much continuity is safe to assume? How much difference has been smoothed over by modern expectation? The answers remain cautious. Clay dislikes confidence. You can picture the damaged tablet now. The signs are there, but not enough. The narrative steps forward, then stumbles where the surface is lost. In those gaps, Ziusudra becomes both person and symbol. He is a king, a pious servant, a listener, a survivor, and perhaps the last witness to a world whose full outline is gone. This is the attention peak hidden in his quietness. The most important witness cannot give full testimony. The one who crosses the flood reaches us through broken lines. That makes the myth feel almost self-aware, as if the form of the surviving text imitates the content of the story. A shattered account tells of a shattered world. A partial tablet preserves a partial memory. A survivor stands between ages, and we meet him only through what remains after another kind of flood, the flood of time. The old scribes may not have intended that echo, but it is there. You stand with Ziusudra at the edge of the imagined waters. The sky is lowered. The air smells of rain, river mud, and fear held too long in silence. The city behind him is still recognizable. Doorways, walls, roofs, ovens, storage rooms, shrines, and paths all remain in place. That is the cruelest moment before catastrophe, when everything still exists. The world is not gone yet. It is almost gone. In later traditions, the flood survivor often offers sacrifice after the waters recede. This detail matters because it marks the restoration of relationship between humans and gods. The survivor does not simply step into a cleansed earth and begin again as if nothing happened. He performs a ritual. He acknowledges divine order. He reconnects the broken human world to the sacred one. After disaster, memory returns through offering. This is a very Mesopotamian kind of renewal. The rebuilt world must be ritually aligned. Survival alone is not enough. The gods must be addressed. The order must be recognized. A human who crosses catastrophe must not merely live. He must resume the duties that define human life within the system. The burden returns, even after the flood. That may be the most sobering part of all. The catastrophe does not free humanity from service. It reduces, purifies, interrupts, or reorders life. depending on how one reads the story, but the basic structure remains. Humans still stand below the gods. They still offer, they still build, they still remember through ritual. The beginning has been broken, but the system continues. This continuity can be read many ways. Historically, it reflects the resilience of institutions and traditions after real disasters. Theologically, it shows that divine order survives catastrophe. Politically, it helps explain how kingship and city life remain legitimate despite rupture. Symbolically, it suggests that human beings cannot return behind their assigned role, even when the world is remade. The flood washes away many things. It does not wash away purpose. You follow Ziusudra into the dim aftermath. The waters have withdrawn far enough for land to show. Mud grips the feet. Broken reeds lie tangled against debris. The air is strangely still, as if sound itself has been exhausted. In this quiet, survival does not feel triumphant. It feels fragile, stunned, almost guilty. What does he remember first? The warning? The lost voices? The shape of the city before water? The face of the god who allowed him to live? The text cannot tell you everything. Perhaps it never could. In some traditions, the survivor is granted a special destiny, even a kind of distant life beyond ordinary human limits. That detail, where it appears in related Mesopotamian traditions, makes him less an ordinary ancestor and more a boundary figure. He belongs partly to humanity and partly to the realm of myth. A man who remembers too much cannot return completely. That is one possible reading. Another is simpler. The survivor becomes sacred because he carries the continuity of life. His special fate marks the enormity of what he endured. Ancient literature often honours boundary figures by placing them outside normal conditions. They are not like everyone else because the story needs them to stand at the edge. Either way, Ziusudra remains quiet. He's not loud enough for modern drama. He is better than that. He stands in the damp light as the first human after forgetting, or one of the last humans before a new kind of remembering. The world behind him is gone. The world ahead is not yet named. In his silence, the old question returns. If the beginning was already hidden before the flood, and the flood narrowed memory even further, what could later humanity truly know of its first origin? Only what crossed? Only what was copied? Only what the gods, the survivor, and the scribes allowed to remain. The river settles back into its course. Birds return cautiously to the reeds. The air cools. Somewhere, a small fire is kindled, and its smoke rises into a sky that has seen too much water. A ritual begins, simple and trembling, and with it the human world starts again. Not from the true beginning, from the surviving one, from the surviving fire, other figures begin to appear. They do not arrive like kings, they arrive more like memories of instruction. In Mesopotamian tradition, there are beings known in later sources as the apkallu, often translated as sages, wise men, or culture bringers. They stand in a strange place between myth and learning, between the time before the flood and the ordered world that follows. They are not simple. That is why they matter. Some traditions remember 7 antediluvian sages associated with early kings and ancient cities. They are linked with wisdom, ritual knowledge, craftsmanship, and the foundations of civilized order. In later first millennium sources, their memory becomes especially vivid, sometimes connected with protective figures, ritual experts, and beings of unusual form. Certain depictions show fish-cloaked figures, human bodies wrapped in the skin or shape of a fish, performing gestures of purification or blessing. The image is quiet but unforgettable. A human-like figure stands in a long fish garment. The fish head rises above his own like a second face. In one hand he may carry a small bucket. In another, a cone-shaped object used in ritual imagery. He's not frightening in a loud way. He is stranger than that. He looks like a person dressed as a memory no one fully explains anymore. The old world often teaches through symbols. The apkallu are one of the most debated and fascinating of those symbols. In mainstream scholarship, they are generally understood within Mesopotamian traditions of wisdom. kingship, ritual protection, and learned culture. They may represent legendary sages who brought arts, crafts, social order, and religious knowledge to humankind. Their later forms also appear in protective magical contexts, where wisdom and ritual power guard spaces from danger. They belong to knowledge. They also belong to threshold places. That threshold quality invites careful speculation. Some fringe readers have connected the fish-cloaked sages with memories of beings emerging from the waters to teach early humanity. They point especially to later accounts outside the earlier Sumerian texts, including traditions about culture bringers associated with the sea or deep waters. Such readings can quickly outrun the evidence. The imagery does not prove ancient visitors, hidden technologies, or literal non-human teachers. Still, the pattern is curious. Wisdom comes from before the flood. Wisdom is linked to water. Wisdom is carried by figures not entirely ordinary. The cautious reading is already rich enough. In Mesopotamia, water was life, depth, danger, and hidden source. Enki's watery Abzu was associated with wisdom and craft. If sages are imagined through aquatic symbols, that may reflect the deep connection between knowledge and the life-giving waters beneath the world. The fish cloak may not hide a secret species. It may clothe wisdom in the image of the source from which life emerges. Yet the old image still holds you. A sage wrapped in a fish. A city learning from someone older than the city. A ritual gesture repeated after the meaning has grown dim. You walk now into a palace or temple doorway where such figures might be carved in relief. The stone is cool under moonlight. The air smells faintly of dust, cedar, and old incense. Human feet have passed this threshold for generations. The carved figure stands near the entrance, not speaking, only holding his object in a gesture that suggests purification, protection, or sacred maintenance. He guards the boundary. He also reminds you that knowledge itself can be a boundary. In later Mesopotamian learned tradition, the sages could be associated with ancient expertise transmitted to human specialists. Ritual scholars, exorcists, scribes, and learned priests lived within a culture that valued old knowledge intensely. To claim connection with antediluvian wisdom was to root present expertise in a world before ordinary history. It gave authority not through novelty, but through depth. Knowledge became older than the scholar. That is a quiet attention peak. The deepest learning was imagined not as invention, but as inheritance from before the flood. This matters because it turns memory into a sacred chain. A ritual expert does not merely know techniques. He stands at the end of a transmission that reaches backward into mythic time. A scribe does not merely copy signs. He participates in an order whose first teachers may have belonged to a world lost beneath the waters. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is powerful. True knowledge comes from before forgetting. The scholarly uncertainty lies in how these traditions developed. The apkallu appear most clearly in later textual and iconographic contexts, and researchers debate how far certain ideas can be projected backward into earlier Sumerian religion. Were the 7 sages originally independent legendary figures, ritual prototypes, priestly ancestors, or theological symbols? How did their identities change across centuries? How did protective images relate to literary traditions of antediluvian wisdom? The answers are layered. Like everything else, a modern listener may want to place the apkallu neatly beside the Anunnaki, as if they belong to the same group of mysterious beings. The relationship is not so simple. The Anunnaki are divine powers or groups of gods within Mesopotamian religious thought, while the apkallu are sages, culture figures, and ritual beings in learned tradition. They are not interchangeable, yet both occupy the atmosphere of old authority, hidden order, and knowledge descending from a world beyond normal human reach. They belong to the same haunted architecture of memory. One group governs, another instructs. Human beings receive. This receiving is the important part. The apkallu tradition suggests that civilization is not merely built from trial and error. It is taught, transmitted, handed down, or restored. Again, the old Mesopotamian imagination leans toward inheritance. Culture arrives through figures who know before ordinary humans know. The city learns from those standing closer to the beginning. If humanity was never meant to remember the beginning fully, perhaps it was allowed to remember instructions, not the source. The method, not the first council. The ritual, not the original design. The usable pattern. That idea fits the mood of the surviving records. The earliest human world is filled with tasks, offices, offerings, signs, seals, and lists. It is less concerned with giving every person full access to cosmic history than with maintaining order. The apkallu, in this reading, become guardians of procedure. They carry pieces of wisdom across the threshold between lost time and organized life. You hear the sound of water again. Not flood water now, but deep water under the earth. The imagined Abzu where hidden wisdom rests. The city above is warm, crowded, and dusty. Below it, in sacred thought, lies a cool, unseen reservoir. The sage stands between those realms. His fish cloak makes him seem to belong to both. He's dry enough to walk among humans, wet enough to remember the deep. A strange figure, a gentle one, perhaps. The fringe imagination often makes such beings too loud, turning them into obvious messengers from beyond the stars or engineers of human destiny. The older image is more delicate. It does not need metal, machines, or spectacle. It needs water, ritual, memory, and a body shaped like a question. Why does wisdom wear a fish? Why does knowledge come from before the flood? Why do later scholars claim ancestry from beings who stand at the edge of human time? The answers remain uncertain, and that uncertainty is valuable. It keeps the image from collapsing into one meaning. The fish-cloaked sage can be ritual symbol, priestly ancestor, mythic teacher, protective spirit, memory of deep water, and invitation to wonder at once. Night settles round the doorway. The carved figure does not move. His gesture remains fixed, repeated through centuries of eyes passing beneath him. Perhaps most people no longer ask what every detail means. They simply know that he belongs there, that his presence protects, that his form carries old wisdom forward. That is how beginnings survive when they cannot be explained. They become guardians. They become gestures. They become figures at thresholds, holding objects whose names are known while their first meanings fade. And as you pass quietly beneath the gaze of the sage, you feel that humanity may not have remembered the beginning as a story, but as instruction left behind by those who stood nearer to the first light and then withdrew into symbol. Beyond the threshold, humanity begins again, but not quite as it was. That is the feeling left by the flood traditions, the king lists, the old sages, and the careful memory of cities. A world survives. Yes, but survival is never the same as return. Something has passed through water, silence, and selection. Something has been carried forward. Something else has been left behind where no tablet can reach it. The human order after catastrophe feels reconstructed, not newly born, reassembled. You walk through a city rebuilding itself in the cool light after dawn. Walls are patched. Bricks are stacked. Watermarks linger on lower surfaces. A broken door is lifted back into place. A woman rinses silt from a jar that somehow survived. A child finds a bead in the mud and holds it up like a tiny recovered star. Life resumes with the strange carefulness of people who know that ordinary things can disappear. The world has become precious. In Mesopotamian thought, the post-flood world does not abandon divine structure. Kingship returns. Cities rise. Temples matter. Offerings continue. Scribes write. The gods remain above and within the pattern of life. Yet the long antediluvian scale has ended. Human time feels smaller, more bounded, closer to the measured rhythm of ordinary mortality. The great spans are gone. This change is especially visible in the Sumerian king list, where the vast reigns before the flood give way to shorter, more historically recognizable sequences. The list still contains problems, exaggerations, political shaping, and difficult chronology, but the mood shifts. Time becomes less cosmic and more human. Rule still descends, but its holders are increasingly tied to cities whose histories can be approached through archaeology, inscriptions, and comparison. That shift is a quiet attention peak. After the flood, human history becomes readable. Not perfectly readable, but less impossible. This raises a soft and unsettling question. Did the flood mark not only the end of an earlier age, but the beginning of a different kind of humanity, one that lives under stricter limits? In the texts, humanity after catastrophe still works, worships, suffers, and dies. The divine order continues, but human life seems more carefully bounded by mortality and social structure. The world has not been freed, it has been regulated. Scholars usually understand this through literary and theological development. The flood marks a boundary between mythic time and historical time. Many cultures use such boundaries. Before the Great Rupture, beings live longer, kings are larger than life, gods walk nearer, and events happen on a scale ordinary history cannot contain. Afterward, the world settles into familiar limits. The pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia, though Mesopotamia gives it unusually early written form. Mythic time narrows into human time. That is the grounded reading, and it is strong. Yet the speculative side remains quietly present. Some have wondered whether stories of post-flood humanity preserve an ancient memory of deliberate reordering. In this view, catastrophe is followed by a managed reset, where knowledge, rulership, ritual, and social duties are transmitted in selected forms. Humans after the flood inherit civilization, but not the full memory of what came before. They receive instructions without full access to origin. This remains interpretation, not proof, but it fits the emotional architecture of the myths. The survivor carries memory. The sages carry wisdom. Kingship resumes. Temples restore order. Scribes copy what must not be lost. The system does not restart randomly. It restarts with continuity carefully preserved, though reduced. The old world does not return in full. It returns as fragments arranged into a usable human order. A second human order. That phrase does not need to mean a different species, a secret experiment, or a hidden biological transformation. It can mean something subtler, a new arrangement of human memory after disaster. A society that survives catastrophe is not the same society. Its rituals may harden, its stories may become sacred, its institutions may become more urgent because people have learned how quickly the world can fail. After loss, order becomes holy. You can feel that in the rebuilt streets. The first canal cleared after disaster is more than infrastructure. It is defiance against chaos. The first offering placed in the restored temple is more than devotion. It is a signal that the relationship between humans and gods continues. The first tablet written after ruin is more than administration. It is a refusal to let memory dissolve. Clay becomes resistance. The scholarly uncertainty here turns around how much continuity ancient Mesopotamians believed existed between pre-flood and post-flood worlds. The texts preserve links, but they also emphasize rupture. Did later scribes imagine the antediluvian age as moral warning, sacred antiquity, political prelude, or mythic foundation? Did they think of post-flood kingship as restored from heaven, rescued through tradition, or newly granted? The evidence allows several careful answers. None removes the mood of transition. You enter a scribal room in this rebuilt world. The walls are dry now. The floor has been swept. A teacher lays out a model tablet. A student presses the first wedge too deeply, then smooths the clay and tries again. Outside, labourers argue about bricks. Inside, the old words return through new hands. The beginning is not remembered by direct sight, it is taught. This is how the second order forms. Through discipline, through repetition, through accepted limits, Perhaps that is why later Mesopotamian literature often feels so concerned with boundaries. Humans may seek fame, wisdom, and long life, but immortality belongs elsewhere. Kings may become great, but they remain dependent on divine favour. Cities may rise splendidly, but they remain vulnerable to water, war, abandonment, and time. Knowledge may descend from before the flood, but not all knowledge is for everyone. Human life is placed inside fences. Some are visible, some are sacred. In this light, the Anunnaki and other divine powers appear as part of the architecture of limits. They belong to the larger order that determines rank, fate, judgment, and cosmic placement. They are not merely characters in old tales. They are signs of a universe where authority precedes humanity. Humans do not create the structure. They awaken inside it, inherit it, serve it, and remember it incompletely. That incomplete memory may be the most human part. You stand in the evening near a rebuilt temple wall. New bricks show brighter than old ones. The repair is visible, and no one tries to hide it. A repaired wall tells the truth more honestly than a perfect one. It says damage happened. It says hands returned. It says continuity is not the absence of breaking, but the labour of building again. The post-flood world is such a wall, a repaired humanity. The unusual fringe idea of a second human order can be softened into this image. Not a sensational replacement of one humanity by another, but a remembered division between ages. Before the rupture, time stretches into impossible reigns. Sages stand close to origins, and divine decisions shape human existence from above. After the rupture, people live within shorter spans, clearer duties, and written systems that preserve only what can be carried. This does not solve the mystery. It deepens it gently. If humanity after the flood is rebuilt through selected memory, then the beginning is no longer a place anyone can simply return to. It is behind water, behind divine counsel, behind fragmentary texts, behind the choices of survivors and scribes. It is not erased completely. It is filtered into roles, rituals, names, stories, and warnings. The old beginning becomes a pattern inside the new order. You hear evening insects along the canal. The rebuilt city glows in low amber light. A temple door closes. A seal presses into clay. Somewhere, a student repeats a list of ancient names, perhaps bored, perhaps unaware that the act itself is a bridge across forgetting. The first world is gone. The second one writes, and in the spaces between its lines, you sense that human beings may have been allowed to carry the burden forward, but not the full memory of the hands that first placed it upon them. The student's list of ancient names does not stay young. It grows old through repetition. A name copied once is an exercise. A name copied across generations becomes tradition. A myth written for learning becomes a vessel. A formula pressed into clay by tired hands becomes part of the long chain by which the past survives. The scribe may seem small beside kings, gods, floods, and temples, but his careful hand decides what reaches the future. That power is quiet. It is also enormous. You sit in the scribal room while the late sun slips down the wall. The floor is packed earth. The air smells of damp clay, reed, dust, and warm bodies. A teacher moves slowly between students, correcting signs, reciting words, and carrying a memory far older than anyone in the room. The students are not discovering the beginning. They are learning the approved shapes through which the beginning may be approached. Memory becomes technique. A reed stylus must be cut properly. Clay must be smoothed to the right softness. Signs must be placed in order. A student must learn how one wedge differs from another, how a word shifts by context, how divine names must not be carelessly mangled. Writing is physical before it's intellectual. The hand learns before the mind fully understands. That grounded fact matters. Ancient scribal culture preserved knowledge through discipline, not magic. Students copied lexical lists, model documents, proverbs, hymns, and literary compositions. They learned Sumerian, Akkadian, signs, meanings, and conventions across long periods of change. This training helped transmit texts that might otherwise have vanished. Without such habits, many myths of creation, flood, kingship, and divine order would be lost beyond recovery. The beginning survives because someone practiced. That is almost painfully human. Yet preservation is never neutral. Every copy is also a moment of interpretation. A scribe may correct what he believes is an error. He may modernize a phrase, misunderstand an old sign, harmonize a story with a familiar version, or preserve an archaic form without knowing its first setting. He may copy faithfully from a damaged exemplar, leaving the damage as silence. He may fill a gap according to learned expectation. The past passes through judgment, sometimes through boredom, sometimes through devotion. The scholarly uncertainty here is subtle. How much did scribes understand of the oldest traditions they copied? Did they see certain myths as sacred history, literary heritage, theological explanation, school material, or all of these together? Did a learned scribe hear ancient Sumerian lines as living speech, prestigious memory, or ritual language from a world already remote? The evidence gives clues, but not complete interior answers. We know the tablets. We do not fully know the listening. That is a quiet attention peak. A story can be preserved without being understood in its oldest sense. Consider what happens when language itself becomes ancient. Sumerian remained a learned and prestigious written language long after it ceased to be the everyday spoken language for many communities. A scribe could copy Sumerian compositions in a world where Akkadian dominated daily life. That means the past was not only distant in time, it was distant in language. Translation entered the bloodstream of memory. When a story crosses from one language environment to another, meanings shift. A divine title may carry one resonance in Sumerian and another in Akkadian. A word for a cosmic function may become a term of theology, ritual, or literary convention. Later readers may preserve the sound while softening the original force. The story remains, but its first temperature changes. This is how the beginning cools, not all at once. Line by line, you watch the scribe copy a myth of creation. He knows the signs well enough to move steadily. The clay receives each wedge with a soft pressure. He pauses at a divine name. Careful now. The name carries weight. It belongs not only to grammar, but to order. He presses the sign. Then the next, building the god on clay stroke by stroke. The name is remade. A god re-enters the room. This act is both preservation and transformation. The scribe does not create the god, of course, but he recreates the written form through which later minds can meet that god. He renews the path. Yet the path is narrower than the living tradition may once have been. Gesture, tone, local ritual, music, joke, fear, and unofficial versions may all have fallen away. What remains is powerful, but partial. Some fringe interpretations imagine scribes as guardians of hidden knowledge about the Anunnaki, keeping forbidden origins from ordinary people. That image is dramatic, and drama is tempting. A more careful view is quieter. Scribes guarded knowledge because literacy itself was restricted, training was specialized, and institutions naturally controlled what they taught. The result may feel hidden to us, but it did not require a hidden conspiracy. Access was already limited by skill. You cannot remember what you cannot read, and you cannot read what no one teaches you. This brings the question into a sharper, softer form. If humans were never meant to remember the beginning, perhaps it was not because memory was locked away behind a single forbidden door. Perhaps the beginning became inaccessible through ordinary processes, language change, institutional selection, broken tablets, ritual secrecy, political rewriting, environmental destruction, and the simple fact that human lifetimes are short. Forgetting does not need a villain. Time is efficient enough. Still, the old stories themselves often place the first decisions beyond human reach. The gods deliberate before humans exist. Kingship descends from heaven before the human city can claim it. Sacred powers are transferred by gods. Sages carry wisdom from before the flood. Humans receive, serve, rebuild, copy, and wonder. The structure repeatedly places origin above or behind the human level. That pattern is hard to ignore. The scribe's careful hand works within it. He does not break the structure. He preserves it. He writes a world where humans inherit order, not invent it completely. He writes gods whose authority precedes memory. He writes floods that narrow transmission. He writes kingship as something received. Whether he believes all of this literally, ritually, politically, or poetically, he keeps the pattern alive. The hand is careful because the pattern matters. Outside, the city has entered evening. Smoke rises low and blue. A pot cools near a doorway. Someone calls a child inside. The temple precinct settles into lamplight. In the scribal room, a tablet is nearly finished. The student's shoulders ache. The teacher's voice has softened from instruction into habit. The room is not dramatic. It is where worlds survive. You feel, now, the tenderness of copying. Modern people often praise originality, but ancient memory often depended on fidelity. To copy well was to serve the past. To repeat was not failure, it was care. A good scribe could carry an old sentence safely across a century, even if he could not carry everything surrounding it. The beginning may have needed such hands. Yet every hand is human. Every human hand trembles eventually. A wedge slips, a corner breaks, a tablet is misplaced. A school changes its curriculum, a city falls out of favour, a language recedes. An empire rises and prefers different stories. Slowly, not maliciously. The archive of beginnings is reshaped. Some lines become canonical, some fade. Some survive only because they were useful for teaching signs. Some vanish because no one thought future strangers would need them. That is almost the saddest thought. The ancient people were not writing for you. They were living. They were serving gods, training students, legitimizing kings, feeding households, repairing canals, surviving heat, disease, debt, and flood. The mystery you seek in their tablets may have been, for them, a lesson, a duty, a tradition, or a familiar explanation of why the world feels heavy. The scribe finishes the line. He places the tablet aside. It will dry, perhaps crack, perhaps be stored, perhaps be broken, perhaps sleep under earth until another age lifts it into light. In that future age, readers will argue over signs, debate meanings, and wonder whether the oldest texts suggest that humans were never meant to remember the true beginning. The answer will not stand plainly on the surface. It will live in the process, in copying, in loss, in reverence. In the distance between the first voice and the last surviving mark, the lamp burns lower. The reed stylus rests beside the clay. A young student rubs dust from his fingers and looks toward the doorway, eager for air. Behind him, on a tablet still damp enough to hold a fingerprint, the old story waits for time to harden it. Memory has been saved. Memory has been changed. And the careful hand that preserved the beginning has also carried it one step farther away. The saved memory now turns toward what was never written. This is the hardest part to hold, because unwritten things leave no clean edges. A broken tablet at least gives you a fracture to study. A missing tablet gives you a shadow. But a story never pressed into clay at all leaves almost nothing, except echoes inside other stories, habits inside rituals, and strange shapes that later generations repeat without fully explaining. The silence has no label. Still, it surrounds every archive. You can stand among thousands of tablets and still feel the weight of what is absent. The clay may preserve laws, hymns, accounts, myths, school exercises, royal boasts, medical recipes, omens, prayers, and lists of things once important enough to classify. Yet no archive preserves the whole life of a civilization. It cannot, People forget to write what feels obvious. They hide what feels dangerous. They simplify what feels too old. They leave private griefs unmarked. The past is always larger than its documents. That's a grounded truth, and it matters here. Early Mesopotamian writing grew through administration, education, temple life, and elite institutions. Its survival reflects those worlds. Farmers, builders, mothers, servants, shepherds, boatmen, and field workers shaped civilization every day. But their inner lives rarely reach us directly. Their songs, jokes, fears, family stories, and local memories may have vanished almost completely. History often hears the office more clearly than the courtyard. You move now through a city at night, away from the scribal room and into the spaces where memory was spoken rather than written. A grandmother tells a child why a certain canal is feared. A worker remembers a flood his father described. A priest knows a gesture whose explanation is older than his teacher. A woman sings a line while grinding grain, and the melody carries something no tablet records. These are fragile archives. They breathe, then disappear. Oral tradition can be powerful, but it is not fixed like baked clay. It changes with each voice. It keeps a rhythm, image, warning, and emotional truth, while names and details drift. A place becomes sacred because people keep telling children not to treat it lightly. A ruined mound becomes the home of an old god. A dangerous pool becomes a gate to the deep. A flood becomes the water that once covered everything. The story survives by changing. That creates a quiet attention peak. Some beginnings may have survived only by becoming unrecognizable. A modern reader often asks whether a myth is true or false. The older question may be whether a myth is carrying something transformed. A forgotten settlement may become the first city. A local disaster may become the flood. A memory of skilled teachers may become sages from before the waters. A political transition may become kingship descending from heaven. A ritual practice may become the trace of a divine command. Truth does not always travel in straight lines. Sometimes it travels disguised as meaning. This does not mean every myth hides a literal event waiting to be decoded. That would make the old stories too small. It would reduce poetry, theology, ritual, and social imagination into puzzles with single answers. The stronger view is more layered. Myths can preserve historical experience, environmental fear, political ideology, sacred imagination, and emotional wisdom at once. They do not need one root. They can be a whole buried grove. The unusual fringe tidbit returns through that grove. Some have wondered whether the missing parts of Mesopotamian memory were not accidental, but the result of a long narrowing of access to origin knowledge. In this reading, ordinary humans were given roles, rights, and authorized stories, while the deeper beginning remained with gods, sages, priests, or vanished authorities. This cannot be established as fact. The evidence is too fragmentary, and the idea can become careless if made too certain. Yet the structure of the text makes the thought understandable. The gods know first, the sages transmit later, the scribes preserve selectively, humanity receives the shaped memory. A cautious version of the idea needs no hidden vault. It only needs social reality. Early civilizations often concentrate knowledge in institutions. Temple experts know rituals others do not. Scribes know texts others cannot read. Rulers shape public memory through inscriptions. Communities repeat origin stories that teach order more than curiosity. Over time, people remember what the system rewards them for remembering. The forbidden may simply become the unnecessary. The unnecessary becomes forgotten. The forgotten becomes mystery. Scholars continue to debate the relationship between myth and social control in Mesopotamia. Did origin stories primarily explain the world, legitimize hierarchy, preserve tradition, comfort anxiety, regulate behavior, or honor gods? The answer depends on text, period, audience, and use. A myth recited in ritual might function differently from the same story copied in school. A royal inscription may use divine history differently than a household prayer. Context changes the memory. and context is often missing. You pass a darkened temple wall where old brick stamps are almost worn away. The ruler's name is still there, but faint. He wanted to endure. He ordered the bricks marked so future eyes would know who built, restored, or claimed the sacred work. Yet even his name is dissolving into dust. If a king's marked memory can fade, how much more easily did unmarked beginnings vanish? A brick speaks longer than a lullaby, but even a brick grows tired. This is where absence becomes as important as presence. The surviving Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts may not reveal a complete hidden history. They reveal the shape of what people chose, needed, or managed to preserve. Around that shape, the unwritten world presses in. It is not empty darkness. It is full of lost versions, local gods, early rituals, vanished dialects, forgotten disasters, and human voices whose memory never hardened into clay. When you think about why humans were not meant to remember the beginning, the phrase becomes less literal and more haunting. Perhaps humans could not remember because no humans stood at the divine council. Perhaps they were not meant to remember because the usable order mattered more than the full origin. Perhaps they did remember once, but only in speech, song, and ritual, until time carried those forms away. Perhaps the beginning was never one event at all, but many beginnings braided together. Too complex for any tablet to hold. The question remains open. It should remain open. A closed answer would betray the evidence. The old records invite humility because they are both generous and incomplete. They give names like Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Anu, and the Anunnaki. They give cities, kings, floods, sages, offerings, temple accounts, and divine powers. They show a world where humans stand inside order, service, authority, and memory. But they do not let you reach behind every symbol. Some doors are drawn on clay. They do not open. You sit now near the edge of the city, where the fields begin. The night smells of damp soil, animals, and cooling ash. Stars appear over the flat land, bright enough to make the roofs seem low. Somewhere behind you, tablets dry in silence. Somewhere ahead, irrigation channels reflect the sky in broken lines. Between written and unwritten memory, human history rests. A child falls asleep after hearing an old story. By morning, the story will already be slightly changed inside him. Years later, he may tell it differently. A scribe may one day write a version of it, but by then the first voice is gone. The written text will seem authoritative because it survived, while the voices that shaped it vanish into air. This is the gentle tragedy of beginnings. They are always older than the records that claim them. The Anunnaki remain in this space, neither fully explained by scholarship nor safely released into fantasy. They are names in ancient systems, powers in divine assemblies, figures shaped by centuries of religious thought. They're also part of the larger human ache to know whether civilization began only with us, or whether our earliest stories were already looking backward towards something dimmer. The tablets do not answer with thunder. They answer with damage. They answer with lists, myths, seals, names, and silence. And in that silence, what was not written becomes almost visible for a moment. A beginning too old for clay, too important to vanish completely, and too changed by memory to return in its first form. The silence at the edge of the fields begins to feel like another kind of text. Not a text you can translate, and not one you can place under glass. It is written in layers instead of signs, buried walls, reused bricks, river silt, ritual memory, divine names, and stories that seem to begin after something has already happened. The beginning behind the beginning is never shown directly. It is suggested by the way later memory keeps pointing backward. You do not see it. You feel its outline. That outline appears whenever Sumerian tradition treats civilization as something received rather than invented from emptiness. Kingship comes down. Sacred powers are held, transferred, and guarded. Cities claim divine patrons. Temples are rebuilt as restorations of order. Humans are formed to carry work that was already waiting. Flood divides the ages. Sages carry wisdom from before ordinary history. Each idea can be explained carefully on its own. Together they create a mood. A grounded historian may describe this as the natural structure of ancient religious imagination. Early societies placed authority in divine time because divine time gives legitimacy to the present. Cities gained prestige by linking themselves to sacred beginnings. Rulers strengthened their claims by presenting kingship as descending from heaven. Priests and scribes preserved traditions that made their institutions meaningful. This explanation is strong. It is also not boring. It tells you that ancient Mesopotamians did not see civilization as a random human convenience. They saw it as a sacred arrangement tied to gods, destiny, memory, and responsibility. The city was not merely a cluster of houses. It was a visible form of invisible order. To live inside it was to live within a pattern whose roots extended beyond ordinary time. That alone is mysterious. No hidden machinery is required. Yet the texts keep leaving small openings. The oldest remembered world is already structured. Divine councils deliberate before humans arrive. Creation happens as a response to labour pressure. Antediluvian kings rule in impossible spans. Wisdom belongs to figures associated with deep antiquity. Flood interrupts memory, but chosen transmission continues. The resulting pattern is not proof of a lost civilization, but it does suggest an imagination haunted by prior order. A world before the remembered world. That is the quiet attention peak. The beginning is not blank, it is occupied. You walk now through a city just before dawn, when even the dogs are tired and the last stars linger above flat roofs. A faint smell of ash lies in the air. Somewhere, a door creaks. Somewhere, a woman stirs embers and prepares the first heat of morning. The temple mound is a darker shape against the paling sky. It looks old, even in an ancient world. Oldness has weight. You place your hand against a mud brick wall. Its surface is rough, slightly cool, and powdered with dust. This wall may be new compared with the layers beneath it. Beneath the street may lie an older street. Beneath the temple may lie an earlier sacred platform. Beneath the story may lie a ritual. Beneath the ritual may lie an event. Beneath the event may lie a fear that no one can name anymore. This is how beginnings retreat, not by vanishing in one moment, by becoming foundations. A foundation supports what rises above it, but it is not usually seen. People walk on it, trust it, rebuild over it, and forget its exact shape. The same may be true of cultural memory. The first experiences that gave rise to divine stories may have sunk beneath later theology, politics, language, and ritual. They still support the structure, but they no longer appear as themselves. The mainstream uncertainty remains important. Scholars cannot reconstruct one original Sumerian theory of human beginnings that stands behind all later traditions. The evidence is too scattered, the texts too varied, the periods too long, and the purposes too different. We have myths, lists, hymns, inscriptions, administrative tablets, seals, and later interpretations, but not a single master key. The past gives clusters, not a blueprint. That limitation protects the story from becoming too certain. It also makes the mystery more honest. You're not following one forbidden document. You're following converging hints from many ordinary and extraordinary sources. A creation myth here, a temple sequence there, a king list with impossible numbers, a flood story with damaged lines, a seal image with unclear symbols, a scribal tradition preserving words older than its own age. None is enough alone. Together they hum. This hum has drawn fringe interpretation for more than a century. Some readers imagine the Anunnaki as literal beings from outside normal humanity, administrators of an early world whose memory became religion. Others imagine survivors of a lost advanced civilization teaching farming, law, astronomy, metallurgy, or kingship to early cities. These ideas are not accepted as established history, and the physical evidence does not require them. But the emotional reason for their appeal is understandable. The tablets make civilization feel received. A careful reading does not need to accept the strongest claims. It can simply acknowledge that ancient Mesopotamian literature often places human order under prior divine order. That prior order may be theological, symbolic, political, psychological, or a memory of deep cultural transitions. It may be all of these, braided together beyond easy separation. The human mind dislikes beginnings without witnesses, so it creates witnesses among the gods. Or perhaps it remembers that the first witnesses were never human. That second thought belongs to the dimmer side of the path. It should be walked slowly, with attention, and without shouting. The old texts do not grant permission for certainty. They offer atmosphere, structure, and fragments. They show that humans were imagined as late arrivals into an arrangement already governed, named, and burdened. This is very different from saying ancient people knew a secret modern theory. They knew their world. They knew rivers, labour, kingship, drought, flood, divine fear, and the heavy comfort of ritual. They knew that memory fails. They knew cities fall. They knew rulers die. They knew tablets break. And so they placed the beginning in a realm where it could not be completely lost. Even if it could not be completely reached, they placed it with the gods. That may be the deepest function of the Anunnaki mystery. The divine assembly preserves the idea that the world has an order older than human remembering. Whether understood as theology, mythology, social reflection, or speculative echo, the pattern remains. Human beings stand within a structure they did not make and cannot fully explain. They inherit work, language, ritual, and death. They inherit stories that begin just beyond their ability to witness. The beginning behind the beginning is not an answer. It is a pressure. It presses through clay. It presses through floodwater. It presses through the long lists of kings and gods. It presses through the hand of every scribe who copied words from a past already ancient to him. It presses through the unease you feel when a myth does not begin at the beginning, but after the world has already been organized by someone else. You sit beside the canal as dawn spreads over the plain. The water is dull silver. Reeds lean in the slow current. A bird lifts from the bank, sending tiny ripples outward. Behind you, the city begins to wake again, carrying its duties into another day. No one pauses to solve the origin of humanity. The bread must be baked. The water must be drawn. The temple must be served. Life continues without complete memory. Perhaps it has always done so. The Sumerian texts may not reveal why humans were never meant to remember the beginning in a literal, final way. They suggest something quieter and more ancient. Human memory begins too late. It begins after divine decisions, after buried settlements, after rituals have already gained authority, after names have already gathered power, after floods have already erased older worlds. By the time writing appears, the beginning has become tradition. By the time tradition is copied, it has become sacred. And by the time you read it, it has become a mystery. The dawn brightens. The tablet in your mind remains brown, chipped, and silent. It does not open into certainty. It only offers its small surviving marks, like lamps placed at the edge of a road that disappears into mist. You follow them a little farther, not to solve everything, only to notice how much of the beginning still waits behind the beginning. The road into mist does not end with a revelation. It ends with clay cooling under moonlight, with the river moving past fields in the dark, with a question left unread because the last tablet does not contain the first voice. That is the gentlest and most honest place for this mystery to rest. The Sumerian records do not hand you a locked door and a missing key. They hand you fragments, and then ask you to live with fragments. That is harder. It is also more beautiful. You return once more to the tablet, but now it no longer feels like a small object behind glass. It feels like a shoreline. On one side is what survived: signs, names, kings, floods, gods. temples, offerings, lists, seals, and stories copied by careful hands. On the other side is everything that did not survive: voices, meanings, gestures, local memories, first fears, and the earliest human attempt to understand why life had been placed inside work and time. Between them lies the clay. The mainstream history remains steady beneath the mystery. Southern Mesopotamia gave the world some of its earliest cities, some of its earliest writing, and some of its most enduring myths about creation, kingship, divine order, and flood. These traditions grew from real landscapes, real institutions, real social pressures, and real human needs: irrigation, temple economies, scribal education, political legitimacy, and environmental danger all shaped the way the old stories were told. The ground is real. The wonder grows from it. That matters, because responsible mystery should never float away from Earth. These Sumerian texts are not valuable because they can be forced into modern fantasies. They are valuable because they already contain enough strangeness when read with care. They describe a human world placed beneath divine authority. They imagine culture as something received, guarded, restored, and sometimes transferred. They place the earliest ages behind flood, impossible time, and sacred decision. They make the beginning feel distant on purpose. Or perhaps distance is what happens when a beginning becomes ancient enough. You stand at the edge of a temple courtyard after sunset. The day's heat still rests in the bricks. A faint smell of incense lingers near the doorway. Somewhere, an offering bowl has been washed and set upside down to dry. A scribe's stylus lies beside a finished tablet. The city's noises have thinned into footsteps, animal breath, and the occasional murmur from a roof. Nothing announces itself as final. That is fitting. The old Mesopotamian world rarely gives clean endings. A city falls, then another rises. A temple is destroyed, then rebuilt. A king boasts, then his name wears away. A myth survives, but broken. A flood erases, yet kingship returns. A divine power withdraws, yet ritual continues. Human life is not given closure. It is given duties, memory, and the task of continuing under a sky filled with powers it cannot fully read. The attention peak, if it can be called that, is very quiet now. The oldest records do not simply tell us what humans remembered. They show us how humans forgot. They forgot through flood, through language change, through broken tablets, through selective copying, through ritual repetition that preserved action after explanation faded, through cities built on older cities until the first layer became unreachable, through divine stories that held meaning more safely than they held facts, through the ordinary mercy of not knowing everything. Forgetting is not always failure. Sometimes it is protection. That thought leads gently toward the title's central question. Were humans never meant to remember the beginning? A literal answer would be too firm for the evidence. No tablet allows such certainty. No scholar can point to one line and say that the ancient scribes revealed a planned erasure of human origin. The record is incomplete, and careful reading must remain careful. Yet a softer answer may be possible. In the Mesopotamian imagination, the beginning often belongs to gods, not humans. The decisive councils occur before human witnesses. Kingship descends from above. Sacred powers move among divine figures. Humans are formed to serve an order already in motion. The flood divides ages and narrows memory. Sages transmit wisdom from a time ordinary people cannot enter. Scribes preserve what they have received, not what they personally saw. Humanity begins after the Earth's decision. That is the haunting structure. If humans cannot remember the beginning, it may be because, in these stories, humans were never present at the beginning of their own purpose. They were created within a system already older than them. They inherited the work, the rituals, the fear, the cities, the names, and the longing to know. They did not inherit the whole explanation. This is not a claim of certainty. It is one cautious reading of a pattern. The open scholarly uncertainty remains alive. Are the Anunnaki and divine councils theological reflections of human institutions? Are the flood stories memories of real disasters transformed through sacred tradition? Are the antediluvian kings symbolic expressions of deep time? Are the apkallu ritual figures representing ancient wisdom rather than literal teachers? In many cases, the strongest answer is yes, and also maybe more than one thing at once. The old stories resist being flattened. They are not modern history. They are not simple fantasy. They are clay vessels holding history, theology, politics, environment, fear, longing, and memory in the same curved space. You can hold such a vessel without emptying it. That is the way to approach these texts, not by demanding that they confess a single hidden truth, and not by dismissing their strangeness as primitive imagination. You let them remain ancient. You let them speak in their own texture, with their practical gods, their sacred accounts, their impossible rains, their broken flood lines, their fish-cloaked sages, their temple lists, and their quiet insistence that civilization is older in meaning than it is in writing. Then the title changes in your hands. Sumerian texts do not reveal a secret in the sharp modern sense. They reveal a condition. They show human beings waking into history already surrounded by inherited order. They show memory beginning after memory has already been shaped. They show that the first written stories may have been late arrivals, trying to preserve a beginning that had already moved beyond direct recall. The beginning was not erased completely. It became layered. It became clay, ritual, flood, kingship, temple, labor, and myth. It became something humans could serve, repeat, fear, and wonder about, but never fully possess. You leave the tablet room slowly. The glass reflects a faint shape of your face over the ancient signs. For a moment, you and the scribe share the same surface, separated by thousands of years and joined by the same unfinished question. He pressed the marks because his world needed memory. You read them because yours needs meaning. Neither of you stands at the true beginning. Both of you stand downstream, outside. Night has settled over the river plain. The reeds move in the dark. The old cities sleep beneath their mounds. The gods, whether read as symbols, powers, memories, or something stranger, remain where the tablets left them, named but not fully known. And humanity remains below, carrying a story it did not begin, listening for the first voice inside broken clay. The river moves more softly now. There is no need to follow every question to its farthest edge. Some questions are meant to settle beside you, like cool air after a long, warm day. The tablet has spoken as much as it can. The rest belongs to the spaces between signs, to the missing corners, to the old dust resting in museum drawers, to the low mounds where cities sleep under centuries of wind. You can let the names grow quiet. Eridu, Nipu, Uru, Shrupa. They no longer need to explain themselves. They can return to the plain, to the reeds, to the canals reflecting moonlight. The gods can withdraw into their ancient distance. The scribes can set down their reed styluses. The workers can leave the fields. The temple doors can close with a soft wooden sound. Nothing has to be solved tonight. The beginning remains where it has always been. Not absent, not present, but hidden inside layers of memory. A little of it rests in clay, a little in floodwater, a little in the stories people kept repeating because they could not bear to let the old world vanish completely. Perhaps that is enough. The moon rises over mud brick walls that are no longer standing. The river slides through darkness, carrying silt, reflection, and silence. Somewhere, in the cooled clay of an unread tablet, a question waits without urgency. It has waited for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer. Your breathing slows. The reeds move gently. The ancient world fades, not gone, only distant. And the beginning remains unfinished, soft as dust, quiet as water, and just beyond the reach of waking thought. End of script. Good night.